In the winter of 1941, a young girl stood at the edge of a brick wall that had appeared overnight in the heart of Warsaw. She was 9 years old, and she didn't understand yet that this wall, 10 feet high and topped with broken glass, was about to divide her world in half. On one side was everything she had ever known. On the other side was a prison without bars, where nearly 500,000 people would be forced to survive on streets that once belonged to them. This is not a story about statistics, though the numbers are staggering. This is not a story about evil, though evil orchestrated every moment of what you're about to hear. This is a story about what happens when ordinary people are stripped of everything except their will to survive, their determination to remain human, and their refusal to be forgotten. Between 1939 and 1944, the Nazi regime created over 1,000 ghettos across occupied Europe. They turned entire neighborhoods into open-air prisons, sealed off from the world by walls and wire and armed guards. Inside these walls, millions of Jewish men, women, and children faced a choice that no human being should ever have to make: how to live when everything is designed to make you die. What you're about to witness is the story of those who live behind the walls, the mothers who fed their children on air and hope, the teenagers who became smugglers to keep their families alive, the teachers who ran secret schools and attics, the archivists who buried the truth in milk cans so that one day someone would know what really happened, the fighters who chose to resist with whatever weapons they could find, even when resistance meant certain death. This is their story. Every word of it is true. Chapter 1. The Closing Trap. September 1st, 1939. Dawn broke over Poland with the scream of Stuka dive bombers and the thunder of artillery that shook the earth like an earthquake. Within hours, German forces had crossed the border at multiple points, their tanks rolling through fields of wheat that would never be harvested, their boots crushing roads that led to cities about to vanish from the map. The invasion wasn't just a military operation. It was the beginning of a plan so methodical, so coldly calculated, that even those who lived through it could barely comprehend what was happening until it was too late. In Warsaw, families gathered around radios, listening to increasingly desperate broadcasts as the Polish army fought back with cavalry against tanks, with rifles against dive bombers. The sky filled with smoke. The streets filled with refugees streaming in from smaller towns and villages, carrying whatever they could hold in their arms. Bedding, photographs, candlesticks, small children. They didn't know yet that running was pointless, that the trap was already closing, that there would be nowhere in Poland safe from what was coming. By the end of September, Poland had fallen. The speed of the collapse shocked the world, but it was precisely what the Nazi command had planned. This wasn't conquest for territory alone. This was the beginning of what they called the New Order, a complete restructuring of Europe that placed certain people at the top and others, particularly Jews, at the very bottom. Actually, not at the bottom. Outside of humanity, entirely. The orders came swiftly. On September 21st, Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, sent a directive to SS leaders in occupied Poland. The language was bureaucratic, cold, almost boring in its precision. Jewish populations were to be concentrated in cities near railway lines. Councils of Jewish elders would be established to carry out German orders. The ghettos, though the directive didn't use that word yet, were being designed before the rubble of the invasion had even been cleared. The first city to feel the squeeze was Piotrkow, Treblinka, a textile town of about 50,000 people, nearly a third of them Jewish. On October 8th, 1939, just 5 weeks after the invasion, the German authorities issued an order. All Jews in Piotrkow, Treblinka, were to move into a designated area of the city within hours. Not days. Hours. Families abandoned apartments their grandparents had lived in, left behind furniture that had been passed down through generations, carried their children through streets patrolled by soldiers with rifles and dogs that barked and lunged at anyone who moved too slowly. The designated area was a cluster of narrow streets in the oldest part of town, buildings that were already crumbling, meant to house perhaps 3,000 people now, expected to hold over 10,000. There were no walls yet, no barbed wire, but there were checkpoints. Guards. A boundary you crossed at the risk of being shot. This was the first ghetto, though most people trapped inside it didn't yet understand what that word would come to mean. The streets smelled of too many bodies in too little space, of sewage systems overwhelmed, of fear that had a scent all its own, sharp and metallic. Children cried in the night. Parents whispered to each other after dark, trying to make sense of orders that made no sense, trying to believe this was temporary, that surely someone would intervene, that the world was watching and would act. But the world wasn't watching Pietrkow Trybunalski. The world was watching larger battles, bigger cities, more dramatic headlines. In the small ghetto streets, where families slept 3 or 4 to a room, where bread became more valuable than gold, the future was being written in a script that would be repeated hundreds of times across occupied Europe. Then came Łódź, Poland's second-largest city, an industrial powerhouse known for its textile mills and factories, home to more than 200,000 Jews who had built lives there, businesses there, futures there. The Germans renamed it Litzmannstadt almost immediately, erasing even its Polish identity. In December 1939, the orders began. Jews were forbidden from walking on certain streets, forbidden from using public transportation, forbidden from entering parks. Each restriction felt like a test, like the tightening of a noose one thread at a time, to see how much pressure people could endure before they broke. February 8, 1940. The announcement that changed everything. A ghetto would be established in the Baladi district, the poorest section of Łódź, a maze of wooden houses and unpaved streets where poverty had always lived. Over 160,000 Jews were given days to relocate there, bringing only what they could carry. The lucky ones found a corner of a room. The unlucky slept in hallways, in cellars, in spaces meant for storage, not human beings. By April, the Łódź ghetto was sealed. Wooden fences went up first, then barbed wire, then guards at every exit. The perimeter stretched for nearly 4 kilometers, encircling an area of just over 4 square kilometers. Inside those boundaries, human density reached levels no city planner had ever imagined. No sanitation system could handle. No food supply could adequately feed. Nearly 200,000 people trapped in a space designed for perhaps a fifth of that number. The man the Germans appointed to lead the Jewish Council in Łódź was Chaim Rumkowski, a controversial figure who believed that cooperation and productivity might save his people, make the ghetto essential to the German war effort. He reasoned, and perhaps they'll let us survive. He established workshops and factories, turned the ghetto into a manufacturing center producing uniforms, boots, textiles for the Wehrmacht. He believed in work as salvation, in usefulness as a shield against annihilation. History would judge whether he was right or, tragically, devastatingly wrong. The isolation was total. Mail was restricted. Movement was impossible. Ration cards determined who ate and who starved. And the rations were calculated with precision, just enough to keep workers alive, not enough to maintain health or strength over time. Bread became the currency of survival. A loaf could be traded for anything. Lives were measured in calories, days in whether you had eaten or not. Winter in the ghettos was a killer all its own. Buildings with broken windows and no fuel for heating. Ice forming inside apartments. Children with frost-blackened fingers and toes. The elderly simply stopped waking up, their bodies giving out in the night, unable to maintain warmth, unable to survive on 200 calories a day. The death carts came through the streets each morning, collecting those who hadn't made it through the darkness. Yet even in these conditions, something remarkable happened. Communities formed. Neighbors shared what little they had. Mothers somehow conjured meals from scraps that shouldn't have sustained a mouse, let alone a family. Teachers gathered children in secret to continue lessons. Because education was resistance, knowledge was defiance. Maintaining culture was an act of war against those who wanted to erase them entirely. The Germans watched and documented everything with meticulous care. Photographs were taken. Statistics were compiled. Reports were filed about population density, disease rates, death tolls. This wasn't chaos. This was social engineering conducted with the precision of a laboratory experiment. The ghettos were designed to concentrate populations, to track them, to control them, to prepare them for whatever came next. And something was coming next. The men who designed the ghettos, Heydrich and his deputies, were already planning the next phase. The ghettos were never meant to be permanent homes. They were holding pens, way stations, places to gather populations before moving them to a final destination that existed only in planning documents and whispered conversations among SS officers who spoke in euphemisms and coded language about the Jewish question and its ultimate solution. By the end of 1940, the pattern was established. Invasion, isolation, concentration, sealing. More ghettos would follow across occupied Poland and beyond. Warsaw, Kraków, Lublin, Vilna, Kovna, hundreds more, each one following the blueprint established in Piotrkow Trybunalski and perfected in Łódź. Each one a city within a city, separated by walls and wire, and the absolute determination of the occupiers to divide humanity into those who deserved life and those who did not. Inside the sealed ghettos, as winter gave way to spring in 1941, families tried to create normalcy where none could exist. They celebrated holidays in secret. They sang songs their grandparents had taught them. They told children stories about a world beyond the walls, a world that would welcome them again someday, a future that felt more like fantasy with each passing week. But the walls were rising higher. The wire was being drawn tighter. And in Berlin, in offices where men in neat uniforms studied maps and population charts, plans were being refined for what would happen when concentration was no longer enough, when the ghettos had served their purpose and the final phase could begin. Chapter 2. Architect of Confinement. The mind behind the machinery was not a monster in appearance. Reinhard Heydrich stood 6 feet tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, the living embodiment of the Aryan ideal the Nazis worshipped. He played violin beautifully. He fenced with Olympic-level skill. He spoke multiple languages fluently, and he designed systems of persecution with a creativity and thoroughness that would earn him a nickname among his own colleagues, the man with the iron heart. But iron suggests strength and honor, qualities Heydrich did not possess. His heart, if it could be called that, operated on pure calculation, viewing human beings as numbers on a spreadsheet, problems to be solved through administrative efficiency. September 1939. While tanks still rolled through Polish villages and bombers still darkened the skies, Heydrich was already at work in his Berlin office, drafting the framework that would transform occupation into systematic obliteration. He didn't invent anti-Semitism. That poison had coursed through European veins for centuries, manifesting in pogroms and expulsions and laws that treated Jews as perpetual outsiders. What Heydrich invented was the industrialization of hatred, the transformation of ancient prejudice into modern bureaucracy, complete with forms and stamps and railway timetables. His September 21st directive was a masterpiece of coded language. On the surface, it appeared to be about administrative reorganization, about managing populations in newly conquered territory. It spoke of concentration of Jews in larger cities for better control. It mentioned the establishment of Jewish councils to serve as intermediaries between the occupied and the occupiers. It referenced temporary measures. But those who understood the Nazi lexicon, the way certain words meant something entirely different when spoken by men in SS uniforms, recognized this document for what it truly was: a blueprint for erasure, step by carefully planned step. The directive made a distinction that would prove critical. It separated short-term goals from what it called the final aim, using that phrase, final aim, without defining it. This ambiguity was deliberate. In 1939, even within the Nazi leadership, the exact mechanics of what they called the Jewish question's ultimate solution were still being debated, refined, adjusted based on what was logistically possible and what the international community might tolerate or ignore. The ghettos were both an end and a means, both punishment and preparation. Heydrich wasn't working alone. In Kraków, the ancient Polish royal capital, now serving as the seat of German occupation, Hans Frank had established himself as Governor General of occupied Poland. Frank was a lawyer by training, a man who loved classical music and collected Renaissance art looted from Polish museums and private collections. He threw lavish parties in Wawel Castle while people starved in the streets below. He issued decrees with legal precision that systematically stripped Jews of property, rights, and eventually life itself. Frank's diaries, which he kept meticulously throughout the war, reveal a mind that compartmentalized with stunning efficiency. On one page, he would write about a Mozart concert he'd attended. On the next, he would detail orders for clearing districts of their Jewish populations. He saw no contradiction in this. Culture and brutality coexisted in his worldview without conflict, perhaps even reinforcing each other. The appreciation of beauty making the destruction of those deemed ugly or inferior feel like aesthetic necessity. Together, Heydrich and Frank created an administrative framework that turned persecution into policy. Every ghetto needed defined boundaries. Every boundary needed guards. Every guard needed orders. Every order needed documentation. The Nazi state was built on paperwork, on files and folders and carbon copies that tracked every aspect of the machinery of death. This wasn't random violence. Random violence is inefficient. This was organized, budgeted, scheduled, evaluated for effectiveness, and adjusted when necessary. The ideology driving this machinery had roots that stretched back decades. Adolf Hitler's obsession with racial purity, outlined in his rambling manifesto written in prison in the 1920s, provided the philosophical foundation. Jews were not merely a religious group to the Nazis. They were, in Nazi racial pseudoscience, a biological threat, a contamination that weakened the Aryan race. This absurd belief, dressed up in the language of science and evolution, gave genocide the veneer of necessity, of natural law, of doing something difficult but essential for the survival of civilization itself. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and architect of the concentration camp system, added another layer to this ideology. He believed in creating a new kind of human being, hardened and pure, capable of doing terrible things without moral hesitation because those things served a higher purpose. The men who would staff the ghettos, who would patrol the walls and man the checkpoints and eventually participate in far worse, were trained to see their victims as subhuman, as vermin requiring extermination for the health of society. The ghettos themselves were designed with multiple purposes, each one supporting the next like gears in a machine. First, they concentrated populations, gathering people from scattered towns and villages into centralized locations where they could be counted, controlled, and monitored. Second, they isolated these populations from the non-Jewish world, preventing any chance of organized resistance or escape, creating a closed system where every variable could be managed. Third, they extracted labor and remaining wealth, squeezing every last bit of economic value before moving to the next phase. The Nazi leadership studied history for precedents. Medieval European cities had maintained Jewish quarters, often walled and segregated, for centuries. The Venetian Ghetto, established in 1516 on an island where a foundry once stood, gave the phenomenon its name. But those historical ghettos, while restrictive and often brutal, allowed some measure of commerce, some interaction with the outside world, some possibility of life continuing across generations. The Nazi ghettos were different in fundamental ways. They were designed not to contain but to destroy, not to maintain a separate society, but to eliminate one entirely. The economic theory underpinning ghetto policy was equally calculated. Jewish property was seized through a process called Aryanization, transferred to German ownership, or given to Polish collaborators willing to benefit from their neighbors' destruction. Bank accounts were frozen and emptied. Businesses were confiscated. The wealth accumulated over generations by families who had built lives in Poland for hundreds of years was redistributed within weeks. Those forced into ghettos arrived with nothing, dependent entirely on whatever the occupiers chose to provide, which was never enough to sustain life indefinitely. Food policy became a weapon as precise as any rifle. Ration allocations were calculated by Nazi nutritionists who determined the minimum calories needed to maintain workers productive enough to serve German interests. Jews received roughly one-third the rations given to Poles and one-tenth what Germans received. These weren't arbitrary numbers. They were death sentences written in statistics, slow starvation disguised as resource management. A healthy adult needs roughly 2,000 calories daily to maintain body weight and function. Ghetto rations provided between 200 and 400. The math was simple and horrifying. Every month in the ghetto, bodies consumed themselves, organs failed, immune systems collapsed. Medical professionals within the Nazi hierarchy participated in this planning with clinical detachment. Doctors who had taken oaths to heal contributed to discussions about disease management in ghettos, not to prevent suffering, but to calculate it, to ensure epidemics didn't spread beyond ghetto walls to German populations. Typhus became both a genuine threat and a propaganda tool, with Nazi media portraying Jews as disease carriers, reinforcing the narrative that isolation was necessary for public health. The cramped, unsanitary conditions that guaranteed disease outbreaks were presented as evidence of Jewish uncleanliness rather than the inevitable result of forcing hundreds of thousands into spaces designed for thousands. The Jewish councils, called Judenrat, were a stroke of cruel genius. By forcing Jewish leaders to implement German orders, the Nazis created a buffer between themselves and their victims. Council members faced impossible choices daily: provide lists of people for labor details, or watch random selections take twice as many, collect taxes from people who had nothing, or see rations cut further, enforce curfews and regulations, or invite collective punishment on entire communities. Some council members tried to use their positions to mitigate suffering, to negotiate for better conditions, to save who they could. Others became corrupted by the small power they held, wielding it cruelly over those even more helpless. Most simply broke under the weight of decisions no human should have to make. The spatial design of ghettos reflected Nazi obsessions with control and hierarchy. Walls were built not just to contain, but to humiliate, often forcing Jews to pay for the construction of their own prisons. In Warsaw, which would become the largest ghetto, the wall stretched over 18 kilometers, built of brick and topped with barbed wire and broken glass. It cut through the middle of streets, divided buildings in half, separated families who found themselves on wrong sides of arbitrary lines. Gates were positioned to funnel all movement through checkpoints where guards could search, humiliate, extort bribes, or simply shoot anyone who displeased them. Within the ghettos, internal geography created hierarchies of suffering. Areas near gates, where smuggling might be possible, were precious. Buildings with functioning wells or less damaged roofs became contested spaces. Attics could hide contraband or people. Cellars might offer slight warmth in winter. Every square meter mattered when square meters determined whether you froze or found shelter, whether you accessed black market food or starved at official ration levels. The Nazi administrators kept meticulous records of everything. Population counts updated weekly. Death rates tracked monthly. Productivity levels measured by workshop output. Calories consumed calculated against calories distributed. Disease incidents graphed over time. This data wasn't collected for historical purposes. It was operational intelligence, used to refine the system, to identify inefficiencies, to determine which ghettos were functioning according to plan and which needed adjustments. The bureaucrats who compiled these reports saw themselves as solving logistical problems, managing resources, implementing policy. They used neutral language that obscured the reality that every number represented a human life, that every statistic was someone's child or parent or spouse. Communication between ghettos was forbidden, but information traveled through clandestine networks anyway. Smuggled letters described conditions in different locations. Rumors spread about which ghettos were worse, which German commanders were more brutal, which Jewish council leaders could be trusted. People traded information like currency, desperate for any knowledge that might improve their odds of survival. any warning about what was coming next. And things were coming next. By 1941, the ghetto system was operating smoothly across occupied Poland. Hundreds of locations now held millions of people in conditions designed to maximize death, while maintaining plausible deniability. When people died of starvation or disease, German reports could blame overcrowding or poor hygiene, natural consequences of housing populations too primitive to maintain proper sanitation. When people were shot trying to smuggle food, the reports called it enforcement of necessary security measures. The system had been designed to kill, while allowing those who designed it to claim they were merely administering occupied territory. But the architects of confinement were already looking beyond the ghettos. In Berlin and Krakow and other centers of Nazi power, conversations were happening behind closed doors, in meetings where no formal minutes were kept, using language deliberately vague to avoid creating paper trails that might later prove inconvenient. The ghettos had successfully concentrated populations, isolated them, reduced them through starvation and disease. The next phase required different infrastructure, different technology, different locations purpose-built for the final aim that Heydrich's directive had mentioned, but not detailed. Plans were being drawn. Sites were being selected. Equipment was being tested. The men who had designed the ghettos, who had calculated ration levels and wall heights and guard rotations with such precision, were now applying that same methodical approach to something far worse. The ghettos were not the end. They were the middle. And as spring turned to summer in 1941, as Germany prepared to invade the Soviet Union and expand the war to unimaginable scale, the machinery that would transform confinement into something industrial and final was being assembled, piece by carefully engineered piece. Chapter 3: Warsaw, the largest prison. November 16, 1940. The night before the sealing of the Warsaw Ghetto, thousands of families made final preparations for a journey that required no travel. They weren't leaving the city. They were being locked inside a piece of it, cut off from everything familiar despite remaining in the very streets where their grandparents had lived and died, where their children had been born, where their businesses had thrived for generations. The air that night carried the sound of hammering as workers, many of them Jewish laborers forced to participate, completed the final sections of the wall that would divide Warsaw into two worlds. The wall itself was a monument to cruelty disguised as brick and mortar. Over 18 kilometers long, it snaked through the heart of Poland's capital like a scar deliberately carved to cause maximum damage. 3 meters high in most places, topped with barbed wire and broken glass that glinted in the autumn sun like teeth. It didn't follow any logical boundary. It cut through the middle of Siena Street, dividing a single block so that neighbors who had shared courtyards for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of an impassable barrier. It split Kladna Street, creating a situation so absurd that a wooden bridge would later be built to allow ghetto residents to cross from one section to another without touching the area inside below. The mathematics of the Warsaw Ghetto were designed to be unsustainable from the first moment. 400,000 people, roughly 30% of Warsaw's entire population, forced into an area representing less than 3% of the city's total space. If you spread that number across the territory evenly, you'd have over 100,000 people per square kilometer, a density that exceeded anything previously recorded in human habitation. But the distribution wasn't even. Some buildings housed 500 people. Some apartments held 50, sleeping in shifts because there weren't enough beds, enough floor space, enough air for everyone to lie down simultaneously. The order to move came with brutal swiftness for those caught on the wrong side of the line. Polish Jews who had lived for years in districts now designated as Aryan were given hours, sometimes minutes, to pack whatever they could carry and relocate to the designated Jewish quarter. They came pushing carts loaded with mattresses and cooking pots and crying children. They came carrying elderly parents on their backs when the old ones could no longer walk. They came abandoning pianos and bookshelves and wedding china and family photographs, all the physical evidence of lives that were being erased one apartment at a time. The Germans appointed Adam Cherniakow to lead the Judenrat, the Jewish council responsible for implementing Nazi orders within the ghetto. Cherniakow was an engineer by training, a man who understood structures and systems and the practical challenges of making things work. He kept a diary throughout his tenure, a document that would survive him and reveal the impossible position of a man trying to negotiate with officials who had no interest in negotiation, trying to save lives when every option led to death, trying to maintain dignity in a system designed specifically to destroy it. His first challenge was immediate and overwhelming. How do you house 400,000 people in space adequate for perhaps 100,000? The answer was that you couldn't, not humanely, not safely, not in any way consistent with basic standards of human health and dignity. Families moved into apartments already occupied by other families, strangers suddenly sharing single rooms, hanging blankets to create the illusion of privacy where none existed. Hallways became living spaces. Staircases became bedrooms. Cellars flooded with sewage became shelter for those who had nowhere else. The ghetto boundaries were arbitrary in their cruelty, calculated to include the most dilapidated buildings, the narrowest streets, the areas with the least infrastructure. Grzybowski Square, once a vibrant marketplace, became the ghetto's geographic center, surrounded by buildings that had seen better days decades earlier. Muranów, a district of worn apartment blocks and small workshops, absorbed tens of thousands. The Tlomaki Street Synagogue, one of the most beautiful in Europe, found itself inside the walls, its stained glass windows overlooking streets that had become an open-air prison. The ceiling itself happened in stages, each one tightening the noose a bit more. First came the announcement on October 2nd, 1940, that a quarantine zone was being established due to typhus concerns. This was the lie they told, the public health justification for imprisonment. Then came the actual construction of the wall, built mostly in October and early November, brick by brick assembled by workers who understood they were constructing their own cage. Finally, on November 16th, the gates were locked, guards took their positions, and movement between the ghetto and the rest of Warsaw became strictly controlled, requiring special passes that were nearly impossible to obtain. 22 gates punctured the wall at various points, each one manned by German soldiers or Polish police or both. The gates became theaters of daily humiliation and violence. Guards searched everyone passing through, looking for contraband food, for smuggled goods, for any excuse to extort bribes or inflict beatings. Women were assaulted. Men were forced to perform exercises in the street, jumping and running while guards laughed and sometimes fired shots at their feet. Children learned quickly to make themselves invisible when approaching gates, to move with heads down, to never make eye contact with the men in uniforms. Inside the sealed ghetto, an entire city's worth of human needs had to be met with resources deliberately restricted to guarantee failure. Water came from a limited number of wells and standpipes, never enough for hundreds of thousands. Lines formed before dawn, people waiting hours for the chance to fill a bucket. Sanitation systems designed for far smaller populations failed almost immediately. Sewers backed up, flooding courtyards with waste. Outhouses overflowed. The smell became inescapable, a constant reminder that basic hygiene was impossible when you packed humans together like cargo in a ship's hold. Food entered the ghetto through official channels in quantities calculated to sustain slow death. Each person was entitled to roughly 180 calories daily from official rations by early 1941. For context, a single apple contains about 95 calories. A slice of bread might be 80. The daily ration for an entire human being was barely enough to fuel basic metabolic functions, nowhere near sufficient for people who needed to work, to walk miles daily searching for additional food, to fight off disease in overcrowded, freezing conditions. The black market became essential to survival, a parallel economy operating in defiance of German restrictions. Smugglers risked death daily to bring food across the walls. Some used buildings that straddled the ghetto boundary, passing goods through windows or holes in walls. Some bribed guards at gates to look away during crucial moments. Children became the most effective smugglers, small enough to squeeze through drainage pipes or gaps in the wall, quick enough to dodge bullets when guards spotted them, desperate enough to risk everything for a sack of potatoes that might keep their families alive another week. Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian who had lived in Warsaw for years, recognized immediately that what was happening needed to be documented. He established a secret archive project, codenamed Oneg Shabbat, recruiting writers and teachers and ordinary people to record everything about ghetto life. They wrote about food prices and smuggling methods and German cruelties and acts of kindness between neighbors. They collected official German announcements and Jewish council proclamations and underground newspapers. They gathered it all together, determined that if they did not survive, the truth would, buried in metal boxes and milk cans to be discovered by whoever came after. The winter of 1940-41 tested survival in ways that numbers and statistics cannot fully capture. Buildings with broken windows and no fuel for heat became freezers where people died in their sleep, their bodies discovered in the morning frozen in positions suggesting they'd simply given up fighting the cold. Children appeared in the streets with limbs swollen from frostbite, begging for bread or coal or anything that might provide warmth. The dead began appearing on sidewalks each morning, bodies that had expired during the night and been left outside because apartments had no room for corpses and families had no strength to carry them to proper burial. Typhus arrived inevitably, carried by lice that thrived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The disease spread from person to person through close contact, impossible to avoid when families slept pressed together for warmth. Fever and rash and delirium followed infection. Those strong enough might survive after weeks of suffering. The weak, especially children and elderly, died within days. Dr. Ludwig Hersfeld, one of Poland's leading immunologists, worked desperately in ghetto hospitals with no medicine, no equipment, no resources to fight an epidemic that German policy had essentially guaranteed. Yet even surrounded by walls and death and starvation, people created life. Secret schools operated in apartments and attics because education was forbidden but essential. Teachers risked execution to gather children and teach them mathematics and literature and history. Underground libraries circulated books that had been smuggled in or hidden when the ghetto was sealed. Reading groups discussed philosophy and poetry. Study groups prepared students for universities they might never attend, in a future that seemed increasingly impossible to imagine. Janusz Korczak ran an orphanage that became legendary within the ghetto for maintaining dignity and care despite impossible conditions. Korczak was a physician and educator who had devoted his life to children, writing books and running programs long before the war. In the ghetto, with 200 orphans under his care and barely enough food to keep anyone alive, he maintained routines and rituals. Birthdays were celebrated. Plays were performed. Children were treated with respect and given responsibilities that allowed them to maintain self-worth, even as the world outside told them they were worthless. Music somehow survived behind the walls. Concerts were organized in soup kitchens and community centers. Musicians playing on instruments smuggled in or crafted from salvage materials. People who had not eaten in days would come to listen, sitting for hours as quartets performed Mozart and Beethoven and Chopin, as solo violinists drew beauty from strings stretched over wooden boxes, as singers filled freezing rooms with voices that reminded everyone listening that they were still human, still capable of appreciating beauty, still more than the animals the Germans claimed they were. Religion became both comfort and challenge. Traditional Jewish life required community gatherings, ritual observances, specific foods and practices that ghetto conditions made nearly impossible. Yet people found ways. Prayers were whispered in crowded apartments. Holidays were marked with whatever could be managed. Rabbis debated whether traditional dietary laws applied when any food at all was precious beyond measure, whether it was better to violate religious law and survive or maintain observance and starve. The Judenrat struggled under Cherniakov's leadership to maintain some semblance of governance and services. A postal system operated within the ghetto. A fire department responded to blazes in wooden buildings packed with people and flammable materials. A police force, Jewish men wearing armbands and wielding clubs but no guns, tried to maintain order and enforce curfews and regulations that came daily from German authorities. These Jewish police were both necessary and hated, essential for maintaining basic social function, but also collaborators who enforced the edicts of murderers. Economic life adapted to impossible circumstances. Workshops operated producing goods for German consumption, uniforms and brushes and furniture, and anything else that might make the ghetto seem economically valuable, worth preserving for its productive capacity. Chaim Kaplan, a teacher who kept a detailed diary, wrote about the bizarre marketplace that developed, where people traded family heirlooms for moldy bread, where diamonds bought potatoes, where all normal economic relationships inverted because nothing mattered except the next meal. By the summer of 1941, the ghetto had developed its own rhythm, its own social structure, its own hierarchies of suffering. Those with work permits from German factories ate slightly better and lived slightly longer. Those with connections to smuggling operations had access to black market goods. Those with nothing, which was most people, survived through networks of mutual aid that formed spontaneously, neighbors sharing what little they had because solidarity was the only weapon available against a system designed to isolate and destroy. But the walls were not the end of the plan. They were the middle. And as summer heat replaced winter cold, as death rates climbed from starvation and disease, as the ghetto population began to decline through attrition, German authorities were already planning the next phase. Trains were being assembled. Facilities were being constructed. The largest prison in Europe was about to become the largest holding pen, gathering people together before dispersing them to destinations whose names most had never heard. Places like Treblinka that existed on no civilian maps, but would soon be burned into history as monuments to what happens when humanity abandons itself entirely. Chapter 4. A Geography of Suffering. Across occupied Poland and beyond, the Warsaw Ghetto was not unique. It was the largest, the most densely populated, the one that would eventually become most famous in historical memory. But it was merely one piece in a massive network of confinement that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains, from Germany's pre-war borders deep into territories seized from the Soviet Union. By the end of 1941, over 1,000 ghettos had been established across Nazi-occupied Europe, each one a variation on the same theme of imprisonment and degradation, each one adapted to local geography and populations, each one serving the same ultimate purpose. Lodz, renamed Litzmannstadt by its German occupiers, became the second largest ghetto and in many ways the most economically significant. Sealed in April 1940, it held over 160,000 people in the Balady district, the poorest quarter of Poland's industrial heartland. Unlike Warsaw's brick walls, Lodz was enclosed by wooden fences and barbed wire, a slightly less permanent-looking barrier that was nonetheless just as impassable. The ghetto occupied an area of roughly 4 square kilometers, a zone of crooked streets and dilapidated wooden houses that had been barely habitable before becoming a prison for hundreds of thousands. What distinguished Lodz was the vision of its Jewish council leader, Chaim Rumkowski, a man whose belief in work as salvation would define the ghetto's character and doom. Rumkowski had run an orphanage before the war, a job that gave him experience managing institutions, but perhaps inflated his belief in his own importance. The Germans appointed him Elder of the Jews, a title he embraced with disturbing enthusiasm, plastering the ghetto with his image, issuing proclamations in his name, even creating ghetto currency bearing his portrait. He believed absolutely that if the ghetto made itself indispensable to the German war effort, if productivity could be maintained at levels the occupiers valued, then perhaps his people might survive. Under Rumkowski's direction, Lodz transformed into a massive labor camp disguised as a city. Factories and workshops proliferated, producing textiles and uniforms, boots and ammunition pouches, carpentry and metalwork. By 1942, over 70,000 ghetto residents worked in these enterprises, their labor exploited for German benefit, while they slowly starved on rations, calculated to extract maximum productivity while ensuring gradual death. Children as young as 10 worked alongside adults, their small fingers useful for detailed textile work, their bodies consuming fewer calories than adults, making them economically efficient workers in the perverse calculations of ghetto management. The rations in Lodz were among the most scientifically calibrated in any ghetto, adjusted constantly based on productivity levels and available supplies. Workers received slightly more than non-workers, creating hierarchies that divided families and communities. Those employed in German factories might receive 400 calories daily. The unemployed, the elderly, the children too young to work received less than 200. These numbers were not random. German nutritionists had calculated precisely how long human bodies could function at different caloric deficits, how much could be extracted from workers before they collapsed, when they needed slight increases to extend their productive period. Krakow, the ancient capital, where German Governor General Hans Frank had established his headquarters in the magnificent Wawel Castle, also received its ghetto in March 1941. Unlike Warsaw or Lodz, Krakow's Jewish population was relatively small, around 60,000 before the war. The Nazis gave most of them until August 1940 to leave the city entirely, relocating to other towns or Warsaw. Only those deemed essential workers, about 15,000 people, were allowed to remain, forced into the Podgorz district across the Vistula River from the historic city center. The Krakow ghetto occupied just 16 hectares, a tiny area that included about 320 buildings and 15 streets. The walls themselves were designed with macabre symbolism. Their tops were shaped like Jewish tombstones, rounded arches that turned the entire ghetto into a symbolic cemetery for the living. This detail was not accidental. The Nazi mind delighted in such touches, psychological torture embedded in architecture, constant reminders that those imprisoned were already considered dead by their captors. Lublin, a city in eastern Poland with deep Jewish roots stretching back 6 centuries, became home to one of the earliest ghettos, established in March 1941. The Nazis chose the Podzam's district, an area of medieval streets and crumbling buildings below Lublin Castle. Over 34,000 people were forced into this quarter, living in conditions so cramped that multiple families shared single rooms, sleeping in shifts because there wasn't floor space for everyone simultaneously. Lublin held particular significance in Nazi plans because it sat near the center of Operation Reinhard, the code name for the systematic murder of Polish Jews. The city would later house Majdanek concentration camp and serve as headquarters for the death camp network. Further east, in territories seized from the Soviet Union after Germany's invasion in June 1941, new ghettos sprang up almost immediately following Wehrmacht occupation. Vilna, called the Jerusalem of Lithuania for its rich Jewish intellectual and cultural heritage, fell to the Germans on June 24, 1941. Within weeks, the Nazis had established not one, but 2 ghettos in the old Jewish quarter. The large ghetto held around 29,000 people. The small ghetto, designated for those without work permits or those deemed less productive, held 11,000. This division was itself a selection, a way of categorizing who might temporarily serve German interests and who was immediately expendable. The Vilna ghetto was unique for its intense cultural resistance. Writers and poets and musicians created works of art in the shadow of death. The ghetto library became one of the most active in Europe, with thousands borrowing books weekly despite barely having strength to turn pages after working 12-hour days on starvation rations. A young partisan named Abba Kovner would later issue a call to resistance from Vilna, recognizing before many others that the ghettos were not permanent prisons, but temporary holding areas before something worse. Minsk, in what is now Belarus, received a ghetto immediately after German occupation in June 1941. The Nazis forced about 100,000 Jews into a section of the city covering less than 2 square kilometers. What made Minsk unique was its proximity to forests where partisan resistance groups operated. The ghetto became a base for underground operations, with thousands eventually escaping to join partisan units fighting in the woods. This connection between ghetto and forced resistance made Minsk particularly dangerous for its inhabitants, as German reprisals for partisan attacks often involved mass executions of ghetto populations. Kovna, or Kaunas in Lithuanian, established its ghetto in July 1941 in the Villajampol suburb across the nearest river from the city center. Roughly 30,000 Jews were imprisoned there, cut off by fences and guards from the city many had helped build and develop over generations. The Kovna ghetto was notable for its Jewish council leadership under Dr. Elkanan Elkis, a physician who maintained detailed documentation of German atrocities, creating a record he hoped would survive even if he did not. His letters to his children, written in secret and smuggled out, provide some of the most moving testimonies of ghetto life. A father's attempt to explain the inexplicable to his son and daughter living abroad. Each ghetto developed its own character, shaped by local German commanders whose personalities and particular cruelties varied, by Jewish council leaders whose approaches to impossible situations differed, by geographic factors and economic conditions, and the makeup of imprisoned populations. In some ghettos, smuggling networks operated with relative efficiency. In others, the walls were more tightly controlled and starvation more severe. In some, cultural life flourished as an act of defiance. In others, the daily struggle for survival left no energy for anything beyond finding the next meal. The smaller ghettos, those holding thousands rather than hundreds of thousands, often faced even worse conditions than the larger ones. Places like Bedzin and Sosnowiec in Upper Silesia, like Radom and Częstochowa in central Poland, like dozens of shtetls whose names have faded from common knowledge, but whose suffering was no less real. These smaller ghettos received even less attention from relief organizations, had fewer resources for smuggling or black market operations, and often were liquidated earlier and more completely than their larger counterparts. Children in every ghetto faced particular horrors that varied by location, but shared common themes of stolen childhood and forced maturity. In Warsaw, children became the primary smugglers, their small bodies able to slip through gaps adults couldn't navigate. In Łódź, they worked factory shifts alongside adults, their wages paid in soup that barely sustained life. In Vilna, they attended secret schools in attics and cellars, learning Hebrew and history and mathematics in whispered voices. In Kovna, they watched parents led away to killing sites outside the ghetto walls, left behind in orphanages or with relatives who had no means to care for them. The elderly suffered everywhere, their reduced rations reflecting Nazi calculations that they contributed nothing to productivity and therefore deserved nothing. In every ghetto, old people appeared in the streets, hands extended for bread that rarely came, bodies wasting until they collapsed and joined the mourning collection of corpses. Their deaths were considered inevitable, unremarkable, not worth recording except as statistics that showed ghetto populations declining toward targets German planners had established. Disease patterns varied by ghetto based on population density, water availability, and sanitation infrastructure. Typhus dominated Warsaw and Łódź, spread by lice that thrived in overcrowded conditions. Tuberculosis flourished everywhere, particularly in damp cellars where families sought shelter. Dysentery killed in ghettos where water sources were contaminated by failing sewage systems. Starvation-related illnesses, bodies consuming their own organs and muscles, appeared in every ghetto as rations remained below subsistence levels month after month. Communication between ghettos happened through clandestine networks despite German prohibitions. Smuggled letters carried news of conditions in different locations. Travelers who somehow obtained permits to move between ghettos shared information about German actions and policies. Underground newspapers published in some ghettos circulated to others, spreading news the Nazi-controlled press would never report. These connections created a web of awareness, allowing people in one ghetto to learn about deportations or massacres in another, providing warnings about what might be coming next. The Jewish councils in different ghettos adopted varied approaches to their impossible positions. Some, like Rumkowski and Lodz, believed cooperation and productivity might save their communities. Others, like Cherniakow and Warsaw, tried to negotiate and delay, while doubting such tactics would ultimately succeed. Some council members used their positions to help, providing forged documents or warning about impending actions. Others became corrupted by small power, wielding it cruelly over those even more helpless. Most simply broke under the weight of having to choose which groups would be sent to labor, which buildings would be cleared, which people would be sacrificed in attempts to save others. Religious life adapted differently in different ghettos based on rabbinical leadership and community traditions. In some places, traditional observance continued despite impossible conditions, people maintaining dietary laws and Sabbath restrictions, even when doing so meant reduced access to food or work. In others, rabbis issued rulings that survival took precedence, that God would understand violations of religious law undertaken to preserve life. Debates raged in study houses and apartments about whether it was better to die observant or live through compromise, whether maintaining tradition honored God or whether survival itself was the highest commandment. The geography of suffering was not random, but carefully planned. Ghettos were positioned near railway lines for ease of future deportation. They were located in areas with existing Jewish populations to minimize initial transport needs. They were sized to ensure overcrowding and placed in districts with poor infrastructure to guarantee health crises. Every aspect reflected planning, calculation, the application of administrative efficiency to the mechanics of degradation and death. By late 1941, as German armies pushed deep into Soviet territory and the war expanded beyond anything previously imagined, the ghetto system was functioning exactly as designed. Millions were concentrated, isolated, weakened, tracked, and prepared. The next phase required only the construction of facilities purpose-built for mass killing, the assignment of personnel willing to operate them, and the organization of transport to move people from ghettos to death on an industrial scale. The geography of suffering was about to expand into territories where ghettos had been merely the first circle of hell, preludes to something far worse waiting at the ends of railway lines, stretching east toward places whose names would become synonymous with humanity's capacity for absolute evil. Chapter 5. The Judenrat Dilemma. The summons arrived at his door before dawn. Adam Cherniakow, chairman of the Warsaw Judenrat, was required to appear at German headquarters immediately. No explanation, no indication of what they wanted, just the command and the implicit threat that refusal meant death, not just for him, but potentially for his wife, his colleagues, anyone the Germans chose to punish for his disobedience. He dressed in the darkness, put on his coat and hat, and walked through streets still littered with bodies from the previous night. This was July 1942, and the world he had been trying desperately to preserve was about to collapse entirely. The Jewish councils were perhaps the cruelest instrument in a Nazi arsenal of psychological torture. By forcing Jewish leaders to implement German orders, the occupiers created a buffer that absolved them of direct contact with their victims, while simultaneously destroying the social fabric of Jewish communities from within. The councils were required by Heydrich's original directive from September 1939, presented as administrative necessity, a way for Germans to communicate with ghetto populations without learning Yiddish or Polish, or dealing directly with people they considered subhuman. But the councils were far more than administrative convenience. They were a trap designed with diabolical precision. Refuse to serve on the council, and the Germans would simply appoint someone else, someone potentially worse, someone more willing to collaborate. Serve on the council, and you became complicit in your own people's suffering, forced to make choices between terrible and catastrophic, between sacrificing some to save others or watching everyone perish. There was no good option, no path that led to survival with dignity intact, no decision that wouldn't haunt those who made it for whatever time remained. The composition of councils varied by ghetto, but followed similar patterns. The Germans typically appointed established community leaders, people with pre-war prominence in business or religious life or social organizations. In theory, these were individuals with experience managing community affairs, with connections and respect that might allow them to function effectively. In practice, their pre-war prominence made their collaboration more devastating to community morale, their familiar faces now associated with German orders, their respective voices now announcing deportations and labor conscriptions and collective punishments. Adam Cherniakow in Warsaw was an engineer, a man of 60 years who had served in local government before the war. He was secular, assimilated, the kind of Polish Jew who had believed integration and civic participation were the path forward. The war and the ghetto demolished those beliefs. Yet he accepted the council chairmanship, perhaps hoping his administrative skills and pre-war connections might allow him to negotiate better conditions, to protect at least some portion of his community. His diary entries reveal a man who understood the futility of his position, yet continued anyway, meeting with German officials day after day, requesting medicine and food and relief that rarely came, trying to delay the inevitable through bureaucratic maneuvering. Chaim Rumkowski in Łódź represented a different approach entirely. He was 70 years old when appointed elder of the Jews, a former businessman and orphanage director with apparently limitless faith in his own importance. Unlike Cherniakow's quiet desperation, Rumkowski embraced his position with disturbing enthusiasm. He commissioned portraits of himself. He issued currency bearing his image. He traveled through the ghetto in a horse-drawn carriage like some feudal lord surveying his domain. He genuinely seemed to believe that making the ghetto productive, demonstrating its economic value to the German war effort, would save his people. Work, he preached constantly, was the path to survival. The strategies differed, but the fundamental dilemma remained identical. The Germans issued orders. The council had to implement them. Provide lists of workers for labor details. Collect taxes from people who own nothing. Enforce housing assignments in impossibly overcrowded conditions. Organize deportations when those began. Every order came with implicit threats. Comply or face collective punishment. Provide the required number of people, or we'll take twice as many through random selection. Maintain order, or we'll send in troops who won't distinguish between resistors and bystanders. The daily operations of the councils consumed enormous energy on tasks that served German interests while providing minimal benefit to ghetto populations. In Warsaw, the Judenrat employed thousands, running departments for housing and health and food distribution and postal services and education. These bureaucracies gave the appearance of self-governance, but the reality was that councils implemented policies designed by Germans for German purposes. Housing departments didn't find adequate shelter because adequate shelter didn't exist. Health departments fought epidemics without medicine or sanitation infrastructure. Food distribution meant managing starvation, not preventing it. The moral compromises began small and escalated gradually, each one seeming necessary at the time, each one establishing precedents for worse to come. Early orders required census data, lists of who lived where, what skills they possessed, who was fit for labor. Council members convinced themselves this information was harmless, administrative necessities that any government would require. But those lists became selection tools when deportations began, databases of human lives sorted by categories that determined who might temporarily survive and who would be taken first. Labor conscription presented impossible mathematics. The Germans demanded specific numbers of workers for specific projects. The council had to provide them. Fail to meet the quota, and random seizures would take people off the streets from their homes, without regard for age or health or family circumstances. So council members made lists, choosing who would go, trying to select those young and strong enough to survive labor, while sparing those too weak or too valuable to the ghetto's internal functioning. Every name on those lists was a human being, someone's child or parent or spouse, sent to brutal conditions for which many would not return. The Jewish police, formerly the Jewish Order Service, became the council's enforcement arm and the source of tremendous resentment within ghettos. These were Jewish men, often young and relatively strong, wearing armbands and wielding clubs but carrying no firearms. They enforced curfews, conducted searches for smuggled food, rounded up workers for labor details, and eventually participated in deportation actions. Some joined the police out of genuine belief they could help maintain order and protect their communities. Some joined for the extra rations police received, desperate to keep their families fed. Some became corrupted by the small power they held, wielding it cruelly over those even more helpless. The police faced hatred from the populations they controlled, yet had minimal actual power. German and Polish police supervised them constantly. Their authority extended only as far as Germans allowed. When German orders contradicted Jewish police reluctance, the Germans simply pushed them aside and acted directly. Yet because they were visible and accessible, because they spoke the same language and came from the same communities, they became targets for anger that should have been directed at the occupiers. They were collaborators, yes, but collaborators who themselves lived in the same prison, subject to the same starvation and disease, just one administrative level removed from those they policed. The most devastating decisions came when deportations began in earnest during the summer of 1942. In Warsaw, on July 22nd, the Germans informed Czerniaków that deportations would begin immediately. 6,000 people daily would be sent for resettlement in the east. The Judenrat was to organize the process, provide the required numbers, ensure orderly assembly at the Umschlagplatz, the collection point where cattle cars waited. The term used was resettlement, suggesting relocation to work camps in occupied Soviet territories. Some council members believed this or pretended to believe it. Others suspected the truth but could not yet prove it. Czerniaków faced the ultimate test of his position: comply with the deportation orders and preserve the council's administrative existence, potentially saving some people by controlling who was selected. Refuse and be executed. The council dissolved. The deportations conducted by German forces without any Jewish intervention or influence. He spent 2 days in desperate negotiations, trying to secure exemptions for children, for orphanages, for the youth of the ghetto, who represented whatever future might exist. The Germans refused. On July 23, 1942, Adam Czerniaków swallowed a cyanide capsule he had apparently carried for some time, choosing death over complicity in what he now understood was murder. His suicide note was brief. To his wife, he wrote that he could not hand over the children of the ghetto for slaughter. To his council colleagues, he wrote that they would blame him for abandoning them, but that he saw no other way. His death was both protest and escape, a refusal to participate further, but also an abandonment of those who remained. The deportations continued without him, organized now by other council members who made the impossible choice Czerniaków could not, providing lists and enforcing assembly, because the alternative seemed to be complete chaos and potentially even higher death tolls. In Łódź, Rumkowski made the opposite choice when similar orders arrived. In September 1942, the Germans demanded that all children under 10 and all adults over 65 be deported. 20,000 people, the youngest and oldest, those deemed economically useless. Rumkowski gathered the ghetto population and delivered a speech that would haunt historical memory. "Give me your children," he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "Surrender the least productive, so the productive might survive." He framed it as terrible necessity, as the only way to save the ghetto's core working population. Some historians call it pragmatic leadership under impossible circumstances. Others call it collaboration in mass murder regardless of motivation. The council members who remained after these selections lived with unbearable knowledge. They knew, even if ordinary ghetto residents did not yet understand, that deportation meant death. Reports had begun filtering back through underground networks about camps that weren't labor facilities but killing centers. The systematic murder of Polish Jews was underway by late 1942, and some council members possessed this information yet continued organizing deportations because refusal meant their own death and the deportations happening anyway, conducted more brutally, without Jewish administrative participation. The corruption that infected some councils made the tragedy even worse. In several ghettos, council members used their positions to secure privileges for themselves and their families. Better housing, larger rations, exemptions from labor and deportations. They created lists that protected their relatives while condemning strangers. They accepted bribes from desperate people trying to avoid selection, creating a market in human life where wealth temporarily purchased survival. Not all council members engaged in such behavior, but enough did to poison the well of community trust that had sustained Jewish life for centuries. Yet some council members used whatever limited power they possessed to help rather than exploit. They forged documents that classified people as essential workers. They hid individuals during selections. They used council resources to support orphanages and hospitals and soup kitchens that kept people alive slightly longer. They passed information to resistance groups forming within ghettos. They documented German crimes in hidden archives. They performed acts of quiet heroism that saved individual lives, even while participating in a system designed to destroy all life. The question of judgment haunts the history of the Judenrats. How do we evaluate people forced into impossible positions, given choices between terrible and catastrophic? Do we judge by their intentions, their efforts to minimize suffering within constraints they didn't create? Or do we judge by results, by the reality that regardless of motivation, they facilitated deportations and labor conscription and the machinery of murder? Different historians and survivors have reached different conclusions, some more forgiving, some less, all struggling with the fact that normal moral categories seem inadequate when applied to situations so far beyond normal human experience. The children of council members faced particular anguish. They watched their fathers become objects of hatred in communities that had once respected them. They benefited from privileges that came at others' expense. Some understood the impossible position their parents occupied. Others felt shame and anger at what seemed like collaboration. Families split over these questions. Siblings stopped speaking. Parents and children became estranged over decisions made under duress that looked like betrayal to those who didn't understand the full context. The councils did manage some genuine accomplishments within the impossible constraints they faced. They organized soup kitchens that fed thousands. They maintained hospitals that provided some medical care despite lacking medicine and equipment. They ran postal services that allowed communication within ghettos. They collected garbage and maintained whatever sanitation was possible in overcrowded conditions. They preserved some semblance of civil society in the midst of systematic destruction. These achievements were real, even if they ultimately could not prevent the outcome Germans had planned from the beginning. By 1943, as the largest ghettos were liquidated and their populations murdered in death camps, the councils disappeared along with the communities they had governed. Some council members were deported and killed alongside everyone else, their temporary administrative importance providing no ultimate protection. Some committed suicide as Cherniakow had, unable to continue. A few survived, living with memories of decisions no human should have had to make, judged by history and by survivors with varying degrees of understanding and forgiveness. The Judenrat dilemma remains one of the most painful aspects of Holocaust history because it demonstrates how the Nazi system corrupted everything it touched, forcing good people into positions where every choice led to evil outcomes, where moral categories dissolved in the face of impossible decisions. The councils were victims and perpetrators simultaneously, trapped in a system designed to destroy them while making them complicit in their own destruction. Their story offers no easy lessons, no clear heroes, only the terrible reality that in certain circumstances, no amount of good intention or desperate effort can prevent catastrophe when the machinery arrayed against you is designed with precision specifically to guarantee your annihilation. Chapter 6: Daily Survival. The alarm, if you could call it that, was the sound of a neighbor coughing in the darkness. There were no clocks in most ghetto apartments because clocks had been sold months ago for bread. Time was measured differently now, in the rhythm of hunger pangs that came in waves, in the intervals between ration distributions, in the hours of mandatory labor that structure days around exhaustion. Morning in the Warsaw Ghetto began before dawn for most people, not because they chose to wake early, but because sleep was difficult when you shared a room with 15 other people, when the cold penetrated thin blankets, when your stomach had forgotten what fullness felt like. Rachel was 19 years old, though she looked 50. Starvation does that. Ages the body at an accelerated rate, carves faces into skulls covered with thin skin, turns hair brittle and gray regardless of actual years lived. She shared a room with her mother and younger brother in an apartment that housed 4 families, 23 people total, in a space designed for perhaps 5. The apartment had running water for 2 hours each morning. If the pipes weren't frozen, if the system hadn't failed, if German authorities hadn't cut service as punishment for some infraction real or imagined. When water flowed, everyone in the building rushed to fill whatever containers they owned. Pots, bottles, jars, anything that could hold liquid for drinking, washing, cooking the meager rations that defined existence. Breakfast was a slice of bread, if bread was available, if the ration card had been honored at the distribution point, if someone in the family had been strong enough to stand in line for 3 hours the previous day to collect it. The bread in the ghetto was unlike any bread from before the war. It was heavy and dark, mixed with sawdust and potato peels and ingredients no one wanted to identify too closely. It crumbled when you cut it. It tasted of nothing and everything simultaneously, the flavor of desperation baked into every molecule. A slice might weigh 50 grams, perhaps 150 calories, the majority of what official rations provided for an entire day. The ration cards themselves were complex documents, color-coded by employment status and productivity level. Workers received one color, entitling them to slightly larger allocations. Non-workers, including children and elderly, received another, their rations reduced to reflect their lack of economic value in Nazi calculations. The cards had to be presented at distribution points at specific times on specific days. Miss your window, and you receive nothing. Lose your card and replacement could take weeks, during which you depended entirely on charity or the black market, both of which required resources most people didn't possess. Rachel worked in a brush factory, one of the workshops the Germans had established to extract labor from ghetto populations. The factory operated 12 hours daily, 6 days weekly, producing brushes for Wehrmacht use. The work was monotonous, repetitive, mind-numbing in its simplicity, but physically demanding when your body was running on 200 calories daily. Your hands moved assembling bristles into handles, hour after hour, while your mind drifted to memories of food, actual food, meals from before the war when eating was pleasure rather than desperate necessity. The journey to the factory required walking, sometimes several kilometers, depending on where you lived in relation to workshops. There was no transportation within the ghetto, except for German vehicles and the carts that collected bodies each morning. Walking while starving is an exercise in energy management, calculating whether the calories burned moving your body exceeded the calories you might earn through work. Some people collapsed on their way to factories, simply fell in the street, and couldn't rise again, their bodies depleted beyond the capacity for continued function. The factories were freezing in winter because fuel was reserved for German use, not for heating spaces where Jews worked. Your fingers grew numb handling materials, making the already difficult task of fine assembly work nearly impossible. In summer, the factories became ovens, poorly ventilated spaces where dozens of workers generated body heat that had nowhere to dissipate. People fainted from heat exhaustion compounded by starvation. Some never woke up, their hearts simply stopping when pushed beyond sustainable limits. Lunch at the factory was soup, if the term soup could be applied to hot water with occasional vegetable fragments floating in it. The soup was distributed from large kettles, ladled into whatever container you brought from home. Smart workers knew to arrive late in the line because the vegetables, what few there were, settled to the bottom. Early portions were essentially water with salt. Late portions might contain actual potato pieces or cabbage leaves, calories that could make the difference between surviving another day or succumbing to the slow starvation that claimed hundreds daily. The black market operated everywhere in every ghetto, a parallel economy more real than official ration systems because it actually provided food sufficient to sustain life, albeit at prices that required selling everything you owned and then some. Smugglers brought food across the walls through tunnels and gaps and bribes paid to guards willing to look away for profit. A loaf of real bread on the black market might cost 50 zloty when official prices were measured in pennies. A kilogram of potatoes could consume a week's wages. Meat was so expensive that most people saw it only in memories and dreams. The smugglers were heroes and criminals simultaneously, risking death to provide what people needed, but charging prices that exploited desperation. The most effective smugglers were children, small enough to squeeze through drainage pipes or gaps in walls, quick enough to evade bullets when guards spotted them. Children as young as 6 or 7 became primary breadwinners for families, crawling through sewers that adults couldn't navigate, emerging on the Aryan side to purchase food with money scraped together through selling family possessions, then returning through the same dangerous route, carrying sacks of potatoes or bread or whatever they'd managed to buy. Death was casual in the ghetto, so commonplace that it ceased to shock. Bodies appeared on sidewalks each morning. People who had died during the night from starvation or disease, or simply giving up, their corpses left in the street because apartments had no space for them and families had no strength to arrange proper burial. The burial society operated carts that made daily rounds, collecting bodies and transporting them to mass graves in the Jewish cemetery. The carts became such familiar sights that children played around them, jumping over the wheels while workers loaded human remains like cordwood. The sounds of the ghetto created a symphony of suffering. Crying babies whose mothers had no milk. Coughing that echoed through thin walls as tuberculosis spread from person to person in overcrowded rooms. The scrape of cart wheels on cobblestones as bodies were collected. German guards shouting orders at checkpoints. The crack of gunfire when someone was shot trying to smuggle food, or simply because a guard felt like shooting someone. Prayer chanted in whispers, because public worship was forbidden. Children reciting lessons in secret schools. The constant murmur of conversation in Yiddish and Polish and Hebrew. People talking, because talking was proof of continued existence. The smells were equally distinctive and inescapable. Unwashed bodies because soap was unavailable and water was scarce. Sewage from overwhelmed sanitation systems. The sweet, sick smell of disease, of wounds that wouldn't heal, of bodies consuming themselves. Bread baking in community ovens, a scent that could drive you mad with desire. The acrid odor of lime used to disinfect areas where typhus had struck. Death had its own smell, a combination of decay and despair that permeated certain buildings, certain streets, certain corners where people went to die away from families they no longer wanted to burden. Clothing deteriorated because nothing could be replaced. You wore the same outfit day after day, washing it when possible, patching holes with scraps when you could find them. Shoes wore out, soles developing holes that let in water and snow and cold. Some people wrapped their feet in rags when shoes finally failed completely. Others walked barefoot, even in winter, their feet blackened with frostbite, but still somehow carrying them to work, because work meant rations, and rations meant another day of life. Personal hygiene became nearly impossible to maintain. The few public bathhouses operated sporadically, when water and fuel allowed. Standing in line for hours to access them required energy many people didn't have. Most washing happened in rooms with cold water and shared basins, cleaning what you could reach, ignoring what you couldn't, accepting that cleanliness was a luxury from the previous life that no longer applied. Lice proliferated in these conditions, spreading from person to person, carrying typhus, causing constant itching that added one more misery to the collection. Entertainment and distraction were sought desperately, because without something beyond mere survival, existence became unbearable. People gathered in the evenings to share stories, to sing songs quietly so as not to attract German attention, to discuss news smuggled in from outside the ghetto. Card games occupied hours, gambling with buttons or scraps of paper, because no one had money worth betting. Chess sets crafted from carved wood or molded bread attracted players who found mental escape in strategy and competition. Sexual life continued in the ghetto despite conditions that seemed to preclude intimacy. People fell in love, married, sought comfort in physical connection, even when privacy was non-existent and the future was death. Some women became pregnant, bringing children into circumstances that guaranteed suffering, yet choosing life anyway because the alternative was accepting that the Nazis had won, that Jewish existence would end with this generation. Chapter 7. Culture as Resistance. In a cramped attic on Noah Lipke Street in the Warsaw Ghetto, 17 children sat cross-legged on the floor, their faces illuminated by a single candle because electricity had been cut again. They held no books because books were forbidden, no paper because paper was precious beyond measure. But they were reciting poetry, lines from Adam Mickiewicz and Julian Tuwim, Polish and Jewish writers whose words the Nazis wanted erased from memory along with the people who cherished them. The teacher was a woman named Gustawa, 24 years old, who had been studying literature at university when the war began. She whispered the verses line by line, and the children repeated them, committing to memory what could not be written down, preserving culture in the only storage device the Germans couldn't confiscate, the human mind. Education in the ghettos was forbidden by German decree. Schools were illegal. Teaching was punishable by death. The Nazis understood that education was dangerous, that knowledge created hope, and hope created resistance, that a people who maintained their intellectual traditions could not be fully subjugated no matter how many walls surrounded them. So they banned it all, declared that Jewish children needed no education because Jewish children had no future, that the only training required was how to work until you died. But parents and teachers refused to accept this verdict. In apartments and cellars and attics across every ghetto, secret schools operated in defiance of orders that carried death sentences. The logistics of underground education were complex and constantly evolving to evade detection. Classes met at different times in different locations, never establishing patterns that informers or German patrols could predict. Students arrived separately, a few at a time, to avoid attracting attention. Textbooks were shared among multiple groups, passed hand to hand like contraband, which they legally were. Lessons were whispered because walls were thin and neighbors might include collaborators or simply people desperate enough to trade information for extra rations. Teachers prepared without materials, recreating entire curricula from memory, teaching mathematics with problems composed on the spot, teaching history through storytelling, teaching language through recitation and conversation. The subjects taught were acts of cultural preservation disguised as education. Hebrew language instruction maintained connection to religious traditions and the dream of Palestine that many saw as the only hope for Jewish survival. Polish literature kept alive the national culture that Jewish Poles had contributed to for centuries. Mathematics and science represented universal knowledge that transcended the particular horrors of the moment. History lessons took on special urgency because the students were living through history of the most terrible kind, and understanding context mattered for comprehending what was happening to them. Some teachers specialized in preparing students for a future they weren't sure would exist. Advanced mathematics for those who might someday attend universities. Latin and Greek for classical education that seemed absurdly irrelevant, yet somehow essential. English and French, because international languages might be useful if the world ever returned to normal. The disconnect between subject matter and immediate reality was striking. Studying calculus when you were starving. Parsing Latin verbs when typhus was spreading through your building. Yet this disconnect was precisely the point. Education affirmed that there was more to existence than the present nightmare, that knowledge had value independent of immediate utility, that minds could transcend circumstances even when bodies were imprisoned. The Oneg Shabbat archive in Warsaw represented cultural resistance of a different kind. Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian who had dedicated his life to documenting Jewish life in Poland, recognized immediately that what was happening needed to be recorded. Not by Germans who would lie about it, not by distant observers who couldn't understand it, but by those living through it, creating a documentary record from inside the catastrophe. He recruited writers and teachers and ordinary people to document everything about ghetto existence. The result was thousands of pages, collected in metal boxes and milk cans, buried in secret locations with the hope that even if the authors didn't survive, the truth would. The archive collected Nazi proclamations and Jewish council announcements, underground newspapers and personal diaries, economic data and mortality statistics, children's drawings, and rabbinical responsa addressing unprecedented ethical questions. It documented smuggling operations and soup kitchen activities, disease patterns and resistance organization. It created a comprehensive portrait of ghetto life from every angle, every perspective, recognizing that future historians would need this material to understand what happened when official records would be either destroyed or filled with Nazi lies. The work was dangerous because possession of such materials meant execution. Writers composed essays in secret, hiding pages in walls or under floorboards. Collectors gathered documents at great risk, transporting them to central locations where Ringelblum's team organized and preserved them. The burial of the archive happened in stages as German actions made it clear that Warsaw's Jews faced complete annihilation. The first cache was buried in August 1942, placed in metal containers and hidden underground. A second was buried in February 1943. The locations were recorded in code and shared with multiple people in case some survived to guide post-war recovery. Music flourished in the ghettos in ways that seemed impossible given the circumstances. Concerts were organized in soup kitchens and community halls. Musicians performing on instruments smuggled past guards or crafted from salvaged materials. String quartets played Beethoven and Mozart in rooms where the audience sat on the floor because chairs had been burned for fuel. Solo violinists drew transcendent beauty from instruments held together with wire and hope. Singers performed opera arias and Yiddish folk songs, their voices filling spaces that smelled of death and disease with sounds that affirmed life and beauty and the persistence of the human spirit. Other women desperately sought ways to prevent pregnancy, knowing that children born in the ghetto faced starvation and disease and deportation to unknown destinations. Religion provided structure and meaning for some, a framework that explained suffering even if it couldn't prevent it. Prayer continued in secret minyan's, the traditional quorum of 10 men gathered in apartments to maintain daily worship despite prohibitions. Holidays were observed with whatever could be managed. Passover without matzah because flour wasn't available. Hanukkah with candles made from saved grease. Yom Kippur fasting that was indistinguishable from every other day's hunger. Rabbis debated whether traditional laws applied in circumstances so far beyond anything contemplated in centuries of Jewish legal scholarship. The dehumanization was constant and deliberate. Germans referred to Jews as vermin, as parasites, as subhuman creatures that needed to be controlled and eventually eliminated. This language appeared in official documents and orders, normalizing the idea that those imprisoned in ghettos were something less than people, that their suffering didn't register on scales of human empathy. The goal was to make both perpetrators and victims internalize this worldview, to make Germans comfortable with inflicting suffering, and to make Jews accept their degradation as somehow natural or deserved. Yet resistance to this psychological warfare took many forms. Maintaining dignity in circumstances designed to destroy, it was itself an act of defiance. Washing when water was scarce, teaching children when education was forbidden, creating art and music and literature that affirmed humanity, helping neighbors when you barely had enough for yourself. These small acts accumulated into collective resistance, a refusal to become the animals Germans claimed Jews were. The strongest survived, but survival wasn't purely a matter of physical strength. Psychological resilience mattered as much or more. The ability to find reasons to continue when every logical calculation suggested giving up. The capacity to hope when hope seemed irrational. The willingness to care about tomorrow when today was barely survivable. Some people possessed this resilience and others didn't, and the difference determined who lasted another week, another month, another year in conditions that killed the majority. Networks of mutual aid formed spontaneously, neighbors sharing what little they had, because solidarity was the only weapon available against a system designed to isolate and destroy. Someone with bread one day might give half to a family with nothing, knowing that tomorrow the situation might reverse, and they'd be the ones needing help. Children were cared for communally when parents died or disappeared. The elderly were looked after by strangers who remembered their own grandparents and couldn't bear to see old people die alone in the street. The contrast between life inside the walls and life just beyond them was stark and terrible. On the Aryan side of Warsaw, cafes operated and theaters showed films, and people complained about rationing that still provided more food than ghetto residents could imagine. The walls separated these two realities by 3 meters of brick, close enough to hear normal life continuing while you starved, close enough to see through gaps that people on the other side lived in a different universe, where tomorrow existed and food was available and death wasn't waiting at every corner. By nightfall, exhaustion was total. You returned from work if you'd survived the day, climbed stairs to your overcrowded apartment if you still had strength, collapsed onto whatever sleeping space you'd claimed, and hoped to wake in the morning. Sleep brought escape from hunger, from cold, from the constant awareness of death encircling everything. But sleep also brought dreams of food, of freedom, of people already dead who appeared alive again in the landscape of memory. Waking meant returning to reality, to another day of survival measured in calories and footsteps, and the simple fact of drawing one more breath in a place designed to ensure that eventually, inevitably, the breathing would stop. The performances served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. They provided psychological escape, a few hours when audience members could forget their circumstances and lose themselves in music. They affirmed cultural continuity, demonstrating that the Jewish people who had produced musicians and composers and performers for centuries had not been extinguished despite German efforts. They were acts of defiance, statements that art mattered, even when survival was uncertain, that beauty had value even in hell, that music could exist in the presence of death, and perhaps even challenge it. Some performances were public, advertised through word of mouth and handbills distributed secretly. Others were intimate gatherings, a few people in an apartment listening to a cellist play Bach suites or a pianist perform Chopin nocturnes on instruments badly out of tune, but still capable of producing something approaching beauty. The venues varied, but the impact was consistent. People who attended concerts reported feeling more human afterward, reconnected to something larger than immediate suffering, reminded that life had once contained more than hunger and fear, and might contain more again if they could survive long enough. Theater companies operated in several ghettos despite prohibitions, and despite conditions that made theatrical production seem ludicrously impractical. How do you rehearse a play when actors might die or be deported between rehearsals? How do you create sets and costumes when materials don't exist? How do you perform for audiences who might not survive to see the next production? Yet theater happened anyway, because theater was necessary, because stories needed to be told, because the act of creation in circumstances designed to prevent all creation was itself meaningful. The plays performed ranged from classics to original works addressing ghetto experiences. Shakespeare appeared on makeshift stages, his tragedies taking on new resonance when performed by people living through tragedy of unprecedented scope. Molière's comedies provided rare laughter, proof that humor could survive even in extremity. Original plays written by ghetto residents depicted their circumstances with varying degrees of directness, some using allegory and metaphor to avoid German censorship, others confronting reality head-on in performances intended for Jewish audiences only. Visual art emerged despite lack of materials. Artists drew with pencil stubs on scraps of paper, painted with watercolors made from improvised ingredients, created images that documented ghetto life or provided escape through imagination. Some art was representational, capturing the reality of streets and faces and suffering with documentary precision. Other art was abstract, expressing emotions too complex for literal depiction. Portraits were especially valued, capturing the faces of loved ones who might not survive, creating visual records that could preserve memory if physical bodies disappeared. Children's art reveals perspectives that adults sometimes missed. Drawings showed walls topped with barbed wire, German soldiers with exaggerated menacing features, smugglers crawling through holes, families crowded into tiny rooms. But children's drawings also showed flowers and sunshine and houses with chimneys, images from memory or imagination of a world beyond ghetto walls. These drawings were collected by teachers and social workers, recognized as important documents of how young minds processed incomprehensible experiences. Libraries operated in unlikely locations, books hidden and shared through underground networks. In Vilna, the Ghetto Library became one of the most active in Europe, with thousands of volumes smuggled in or salvaged from synagogues and homes. People borrowed books at extraordinary rates, reading everything available, using literature as escape and education and connection to the world beyond walls. Waiting lists formed for popular titles. Reading groups met to discuss philosophy and poetry. The library staff risked their lives to preserve and circulate books that Germans would have burned if discovered. Religious life represented another form of cultural resistance, maintaining traditions that defined Jewish identity across millennia. Prayer continued in secret minyan's despite prohibitions against public worship. Torah study persisted in small groups that met clandestinely to discuss sacred texts and legal questions. Rabbis delivered sermons that addressed both timeless spiritual concerns and the immediate crisis their communities faced. Some focused on maintaining faith despite suffering. Others grappled with theological questions raised by unprecedented evil. How could God allow this? What did Jewish law say about situations never contemplated in centuries of scholarship? Holiday observance took on special significance, marking time in ways that transcended German calendars and work schedules. Passover celebrated freedom while celebrating in slavery. The irony painful, but the ritual still meaningful. The Seder question, why is this night different from all other nights, had obvious terrible answers that went unspoken while families who had barely eaten all year tried to conduct ritual meals with symbolic foods they didn't possess. Hanukkah candles were lit in secret, the miracle of oil that burned for 8 days resonating with people trying to make nothing stretch impossibly long. Yom Kippur fasting was indistinguishable from regular hunger, yet people still gathered to pray and seek atonement and a firm connection to God despite everything. Youth movements maintained their organizations underground, providing structure and purpose for teenagers facing futures that seemed non-existent. Zionist groups taught Hebrew and Palestinian geography, training members for migration to Palestine if they survived. Socialist movements studied Marx and organized mutual aid networks. Religious youth movements combined traditional learning with modern concerns. These organizations gave young people identity beyond victim, purpose beyond mere survival, community beyond traumatized families. The movements published underground newspapers that circulated secretly through ghettos, sharing news that German-controlled media suppressed, maintaining communication networks that kept people informed about resistance activities and deportation patterns. The papers were typed on battered typewriters or handwritten and reproduced through carbon copies, distributed at great risk because possession was punishable by death. Yet they continued appearing, defiant voices insisting that information mattered, that truth mattered, that resistance could take many forms, including the simple act of refusing to accept German control of the narrative. Humor survived even in extremity, dark jokes that acknowledge horror while refusing to be crushed by it. People told stories that mocked German pretensions and Jewish council corruption and the absurdities of ghetto existence. Laughter in the ghetto was different from laughter in the previous world, sharper, more bitter, tinged with desperation, but still recognizably human laughter, still a refusal to surrender completely to despair. Comedians performed in cafes and community centers, their material addressing daily struggles with gallows humor that made impossible situations slightly more bearable. The cafes themselves represented culture persisting against all odds. In Warsaw and Łódź and other larger ghettos, cafes operated serving watered-down coffee substitute and stale bread, charging prices most people couldn't afford, yet still attracting customers who craved the semblance of normal social life. People sat at tables and conversed, and listened to performers, and pretended for a few moments that they lived in a world where cafes were normal rather than surreal. The cafes became gathering places for artists and intellectuals, spaces where ideas circulated and plans formed, and cultural life maintained some connection to pre-war traditions. All of this cultural activity, from secret schools to buried archives to concerts and theater and libraries and youth movements, represented resistance of particular kind. Not armed resistance, not the dramatic defiance that would later capture historical imagination, but something equally important. Cultural resistance said that Jewish life consisted of more than German definitions allowed, that education and art and music and literature mattered, even when mere survival seemed like sufficient ambition, that maintaining humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it was itself a form of fighting back. The teachers and musicians and librarians and archivists and students and audiences were soldiers in a different kind of war, battling for the soul and mind and memory of a people Germans wanted to erase entirely. They didn't defeat the physical machinery of death, but they ensured that when the machinery finally stopped, evidence would remain of who the victims actually were, what they valued, how they lived even while dying, the full measure of what was lost, and what almost but never quite could be extinguished. Chapter 8. Children of the Ghetto. Sarah was 7 years old when the walls went up, and by the time she turned 8, she had forgotten what oranges tasted like, what grass felt like under bare feet, what it meant to run without purpose other than the joy of running. Her legs had grown thin as sticks, her belly distended from malnutrition, her eyes too large for her face in the way that photographs from the ghettos show over and over. Children who look ancient and haunted, robbed of everything childhood is supposed to mean. She stood each morning at the corner of Karmelika and No Wallopy streets in the Warsaw Ghetto, a small figure in clothes too large because they belonged to an older sibling who had died, waiting for her mother to leave for the labor detail, so she could begin her real work, smuggling. The children of the ghettos were perhaps the cruelest victims of Nazi policy, because childhood itself was stolen from them, replaced with responsibilities no child should bear and knowledge no young mind should possess. They understood hunger in ways their parents never had at equivalent ages. They knew death as a constant companion, bodies in the streets, so common that children played around them without shock or fear, just acceptance of a reality that had become normal. They learned early that adults couldn't protect them, that the rules had changed, that survival required skills their parents didn't possess and often couldn't teach. The very youngest, infants and toddlers, faced death rates that exceeded all other age groups. Mothers with no milk because their own bodies were starving couldn't nurse babies who cried from hunger that couldn't be satisfied. Infant formula didn't exist in the ghettos. Cow's milk was available only on the black market at prices that required selling furniture or clothing or anything of value. And even then the milk was often watered down or spoiled. Babies died by the hundreds in the first months of life, their small bodies unable to survive on nothing, their deaths recorded in ledgers with heartbreaking frequency, each entry representing parents' grief that had nowhere to go except into the grinding necessity of surviving another day. Toddlers fared little better, their growing bodies requiring nutrition that rations couldn't provide. They suffered from rickets that bowed their legs and softened their bones. They developed kwashiorkor, the protein deficiency disease that caused the characteristic swollen bellies visible in so many ghetto photographs. Their development stopped or reversed. Children of 3 who couldn't walk, children of 4 who couldn't speak properly, their brains and bodies deprived of building blocks essential for growth. Parents watched their children waste away, helpless to prevent it, making impossible calculations about how to divide rations among family members when there wasn't enough for anyone. The orphans numbered in the thousands across all ghettos, children who had lost one or both parents to starvation or disease or deportation. Some were taken in by relatives already stretched beyond capacity to feed their own families. Some ended up in orphanages that operated with heroic effort and inadequate resources. Some simply lived on the streets, sleeping in doorways and ruins, scavenging and begging and stealing to survive, forming gangs that provided protection and shared whatever could be obtained through collective effort. Janusz Korczak's orphanage in Warsaw became legendary within the ghetto as an island of care and dignity in an ocean of suffering. Korczak was a physician and educator in his 60s, a man who had devoted his entire adult life to children, writing books about child development and children's rights long before such concepts were mainstream. When a ghetto was established, he moved his orphanage inside the walls, bringing 200 children with him, refusing to abandon them despite having opportunities to escape to the Aryan side where his fame and non-Jewish appearance might have saved him. The orphanage operated on principles that seemed impossibly idealistic given the circumstances. Korczak insisted on maintaining children's dignity, treating them with respect, giving them voices in how the institution functioned. There was a children's court where disputes were resolved. There was a newspaper where children wrote and published their thoughts. There were celebrations of birthdays and holidays with whatever could be managed. Korczak believed that even in extremity, perhaps especially in extremity, childhood needed protection, that maintaining humanity for the young was worth any sacrifice the adults had to make. But maintaining dignity required resources that barely existed. Food was never sufficient. The orphanage received official rations like everyone else, which meant slow starvation for 200 growing children. Korczak spent his days begging for donations, visiting wealthy ghetto residents who still had resources, performing in concerts, and giving lectures to raise money that could be converted into black market food. He sold personal possessions. He accepted humiliations from German officials and Jewish council members who might provide help. He did everything except abandon the children, which was the one thing he would never do. The children in the orphanage understood their situation with clarity that would be heartbreaking if documented less thoroughly. They knew they were starving. They knew their situation was desperate. They wrote about it in compositions and diary entries that Korczak preserved, young voices describing hunger and cold and fear with precision that belied their ages. Yet they also wrote about dreams and hopes, about wanting to survive to see Palestine or America, or simply tomorrow, about believing against all evidence that somehow things might improve. Education in the orphanage continued despite prohibitions. Teachers held classes in multiple subjects, maintaining standards, insisting that children's minds needed nourishment as much as their bodies, even though only one of those needs could be partially met. The children learned mathematics and literature, history and geography, Hebrew and Polish. They performed plays that required rehearsal and memorization and cooperation. They maintained routines that created structure and chaos, waking at set times, eating at set times, studying and playing and sleeping according to schedules that imposed order on disorder. Outside the orphanage walls, children worked in ways that violated every principle of child development and labor law that the pre-war world had established. In Łódź, children as young as 10 worked in factories producing textiles and boots, their small fingers useful for detailed work, their wages paid in soup and bread that barely sustained life. They worked 12-hour shifts, standing at machines that could easily injure them, breathing air thick with dust and chemicals, returning home too exhausted for anything except sleep before the next shift began. The child smugglers of Warsaw became essential to ghetto survival, bringing in food that official rations could never provide. They were the most effective smugglers because they were small enough to squeeze through gaps in walls, through drainage pipes, through openings adults couldn't navigate. They were quick, able to run from guards who spotted them. They were brave beyond their years, risking death daily because their families needed food, and smuggling was the only way to obtain it. A typical smuggling operation involved leaving the ghetto before dawn, crawling through a tunnel or hole in the wall, emerging on the Aryan side where food was available to anyone with money. The child would have hidden zloty, saved from previous smuggling runs, or provided by parents who had sold possessions. They would purchase potatoes or bread or whatever was available and affordable, stuff it in bags or tie it to their bodies under clothes, then make the dangerous return journey. German guards shot at children they spotted. Polish police beat children they caught. Yet the children kept smuggling because the alternative was watching their families starve. Some children never returned from smuggling runs, killed by guards or police, or simply disappearing into the chaos of the city. Their parents waited at the usual return spot, hoping against hope, knowing with growing certainty that their child was gone, added to the endless list of losses that defined ghetto existence. The body might turn up days later, shot and left where it fell. Or it might never be found, the child becoming one more missing person in a place where missing meant dead, but death without confirmation, without burial, without closure. The psychological impact on children who survived was profound and lasting. They developed what would later be called hypervigilance, constant awareness of danger, inability to relax or feel safe. They learned not to trust adults because adults couldn't protect them, couldn't even protect themselves. They matured early, taking on responsibilities that required adult judgment, while still possessing children's emotions and vulnerabilities. 8-year-olds made life-and-death decisions. 10-year-olds supported families. 12-year-olds had seen more death than most adults experience in full lifetimes. Education took on desperate urgency for parents who understood that knowledge might be the only inheritance they could leave. In secret schools across every ghetto, children learned despite prohibitions and despite circumstances that made learning seem like pointless luxury. They memorized poetry because poetry couldn't be confiscated. They learned mathematics because mathematical thinking might prove useful in unpredictable futures. They studied history so they would understand the context of their own suffering and perhaps avoid repeating it if they survived. The children's drawings collected by teachers and social workers reveal inner worlds of astonishing complexity. Some drawings showed realistic scenes from ghetto life. People standing in bread lines, bodies in the streets, German soldiers at checkpoints. Others showed fantastical escapes. Children flying over walls, families in houses with gardens, tables laden with food. The drawings used whatever materials could be found. Pencil on scraps of paper, charcoal on cardboard, anything that could make marks. Art teachers encouraged children to draw both reality and imagination, recognizing that both served important psychological purposes. Play continued, even in extremity, because children need play the way they need food and water for psychological development and emotional processing and simple sanity. But play in the ghettos was different, shaped by the environment that surrounded it. Children played ghetto games, pretending to be smugglers or guards, reenacting scenes they witnessed daily, processing trauma through repetition and role-playing. They played with improvised toys, dolls made from rags, balls made from paper and string, toys crafted from debris, because manufactured toys didn't exist. Some children maintained surprising optimism despite everything, finding joy in small things, laughing at jokes, believing in futures that seemed increasingly impossible. Others became withdrawn and silent, their spirits crushed by prolonged suffering, their faces showing the emotional damage even when their bodies still functioned. The variation reflected individual resilience and family circumstances, and perhaps random factors that determined who could adapt and who broke under the weight of too much knowledge acquired too young. Teenagers faced particular challenges, caught between childhood and adulthood in circumstances that forced premature maturity while denying normal developmental experiences. They didn't go on dates or attend dances or experience first loves in the usual ways. Instead, they worked adult jobs and carried adult responsibilities and made adult decisions while still possessing adolescent emotions and needs. Some joined youth movements that provided structure and community and purpose. Others retreated into apathy or despair. Some became radicalized, joining resistance organizations that would later fight back against the machinery of death. The religious education that had been central to Jewish childhood for centuries continued in modified forms. Boys studied Torah in secret groups, maintaining traditions their fathers and grandfathers had passed down across generations. Girls learned prayers and customs from mothers and grandmothers who insisted that cultural transmission mattered, even when the future seemed non-existent. Bar and bat mitzvahs were celebrated quietly, marking transitions to religious adulthood in a world where childhood had already ended and adulthood offered nothing but suffering and likely death. Malnutrition affected children's development in ways that would have lifelong consequences for those who survived. Growth was stunted, bones weakened, organs damaged. Brains developing during critical periods lacked nutrients essential for proper formation. Immune systems compromised by starvation couldn't fight off diseases that well-nourished children would have survived. The physical damage was extensive and often permanent, creating health problems that would persist for survivors long after liberation. The separation of children from parents through deportations created traumas that exceeded even the daily horrors of ghetto life. When parents were taken for labor details or deportations, children were left with relatives or neighbors, or simply abandoned to orphanages or streets. The uncertainty was torture, not knowing if parents were alive or dead, whether they'd return or had been killed. Some children never saw their parents again after these separations, the last memory being a figure pushed into a truck or led through a gate, disappearing into a world beyond the walls from which few returned. By 1942, as deportations began in earnest, the question of what to do with children became agonizing for parents who understood that deportation meant death. Some tried to hide children with non-Jewish families on the Aryan side, arranging transfers at great risk and cost, hoping that Catholic Poles might protect their children even if they themselves didn't survive. These separations required tearing apart families, giving children strangers, hoping they would remember their names and identities, praying that after the war ended, if it ended, somehow families might be reunited. Other parents couldn't bear the thought of separation, choosing to keep families together regardless of consequences. When deportations came for their households, they went together, parents and children holding hands as they were led to the Umschlagplatz, the collection point where cattle cars waited. These families disappeared into the system of death camps that had been constructed to receive them, their fates sealed not by choices they made, but by the machinery that had been designed years earlier with the specific purpose of ensuring no one escaped. Janusz Korczak faced this choice in August 1942 when deportation orders came for his orphanage. He had opportunities to save himself, offers from Polish friends to hide him on the Aryan side. He refused them all. When the day came, he dressed in his best suit, gathered his 200 children, and led them through the ghetto streets toward the trains. Witnesses reported that he walked with dignity, carrying the youngest children, organizing the older ones to help the weaker, maintaining order and calm even though he knew exactly where they were going. He and all 200 children were murdered at Treblinka within hours of arrival, along with the teachers who refused to abandon them. The children of the ghettos who survived carried scars that never fully healed, memories of hunger and fear and loss that shaped their entire lives. They grew up to become adults who understood suffering in ways fortunate people never grasped, who valued family and food and safety with intensity born from having lost all three, who built lives and families and futures out of the rubble of childhoods that should never have been stolen, but were. Chapter 9. Disease and Death. The fever came first, a sudden spike in temperature that left you shivering despite the summer heat, your body convulsing with chills that no blanket could warm. Then came the headache, a pressure behind your eyes that felt like your skull was splitting from within. By the third day, the rash appeared, small red spots that spread across your chest and back, the telltale signature of typhus, the disease that killed more people in some ghettos than starvation itself. Dr. Ludwig Hersfeld stood in the cramped ward of the Warsaw Ghetto Hospital, looking at rows of patients lying on floors because there weren't enough beds, knowing he had no medicine to offer them. no treatment beyond keeping them comfortable while the disease ran its course, and either release them back to life or claim them for death. Hersfeld was one of Europe's leading immunologists before the war, a scientist who had made groundbreaking discoveries about blood types and serology, whose research had saved countless lives. Now he worked in conditions that would have been unthinkable at any hospital in the civilized world. No antibiotics, because antibiotics barely existed yet, and certainly weren't available to Jews. No disinfectants. No clean bandages. No proper surgical instruments. No anesthesia for operations performed by lamplight when electricity failed. He had knowledge and skill and experience. But medicine requires more than expertise. It requires tools and supplies and basic infrastructure, none of which existed in quantities adequate for treating hundreds of thousands imprisoned in spaces designed to maximize disease transmission. Typhus spread through body lice, tiny parasites that thrived in overcrowded conditions where people couldn't wash their clothes or bodies, where multiple families shared single rooms and sleeping spaces. The lice moved from person to person through close contact, impossible to avoid in ghetto housing. One infected person could transmit the disease to dozens of others within days. The incubation period meant someone could be contagious before symptoms appeared, spreading infection while still feeling healthy, creating chains of transmission that were impossible to break without the basic public health measures the ghettos couldn't implement. The German response to typhus epidemics revealed the perverse logic underlying ghetto policy. They claimed the ghettos were established to contain disease, to prevent typhus from spreading to the Aryan population. They posted signs at ghetto entrances warning of epidemic zones, quarantine areas that non-Jews entered at risk of infection. But the Germans themselves created the conditions that guaranteed epidemics through overcrowding and inadequate sanitation, and starvation weakened immune systems. They manufactured the disease crisis and then used it as justification for the isolation that had caused it, a circular logic that would be darkly comic if it weren't so deadly. The overcrowding made disease transmission inevitable. In apartments housing 20 or 30 people, where families slept pressed together for warmth, one sick person meant everyone would be exposed. Tuberculosis spread through the air, bacteria carried in droplets from coughs, and sneezes in poorly ventilated rooms. The disease attacked lungs already weakened by malnutrition, causing bloody coughs and wasting fevers and slow death that could take months. There was no treatment available in the ghettos. Patients were isolated when possible, but isolation in overcrowded conditions meant perhaps separating them by a hanging blanket in a shared room, nowhere near sufficient to prevent airborne transmission. Dysentery epidemics resulted from contaminated water and failing sanitation systems. The disease caused severe diarrhea that led to rapid dehydration, particularly dangerous for children and elderly whose bodies had minimal reserves. Treatment required clean water and electrolyte replacement and careful nursing, none of which was reliably available. Patients died within days, their bodies emptied of fluids, too weak to stand or speak, conscious until the end of what was killing them, but powerless to prevent it. Starvation itself was a disease process, the body consuming its own tissues in desperate search for calories that didn't exist. The progression was predictable and terrible. First, the body burned fat reserves, but ghetto residents had no fat left after months on inadequate rations. Then muscles began breaking down, the body cannibalizing itself to fuel basic metabolic processes. Hearts weakened as cardiac muscle was consumed. Kidneys failed as protein deficiency disrupted normal function. Swelling appeared in legs and bellies as fluid accumulated in spaces it shouldn't occupy. The medical term was edema, but in the ghettos they called it hunger disease, a condition that doctors studied with grim fascination because they were witnessing starvation on a scale unprecedented in modern medical history. A group of Jewish doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto, recognizing they were observing a natural experiment of horrific scope, decided to document hunger disease systematically. They measured patients, tracked symptoms, performed autopsies when possible, creating detailed medical records of what happened to human bodies deprived of adequate nutrition over extended periods. The research was conducted in secret because scientific inquiry by Jews was forbidden. The doctors knew they likely wouldn't survive to publish their findings, but they hoped the documentation would, that post-war physicians might learn from observations purchased with Jewish lives. The hospitals in the ghettos operated beyond capacity from the moment they opened. The Zist Hospital in Warsaw, one of the largest, was designed for perhaps 500 patients, but regularly housed over 1,000. Hallways became wards. Staircases held beds. Patients lay on floors in every available space. The staff worked impossible hours with inadequate sleep and the same starvation rations as everyone else. Nurses fainted from exhaustion. Doctors contracted the diseases they treated because there was no protective equipment, no way to maintain the barriers between sick and well that modern medicine requires. Surgical procedures happened in conditions that violated every principle of sterile technique. Operations were performed without proper anesthesia, patients biting on leather straps or pieces of wood to manage pain that couldn't be medicated away. Instruments were reused without adequate sterilization because replacements didn't exist. Infections followed surgery at rates that would have been scandals in normal hospitals, but were simply accepted reality in ghetto medical facilities. Some patients survived their original conditions only to die from post-operative infections that antibiotics could have prevented if antibiotics had been available. Childbirth in the ghettos carried mortality risks for both mothers and infants that exceeded anything in the developed world. Pregnant women arrived at hospitals already weakened by malnutrition, their bodies lacking nutrients necessary for healthy pregnancy. Complications arose at high rates. Hemorrhage killed mothers who might have survived with blood transfusions, but transfusion equipment and blood supplies were unavailable. Infants were born underweight, their development compromised by mother starvation during pregnancy. Many died within hours or days, their small bodies lacking strength to nurse or fight off infections. The decision to become pregnant in the ghetto was itself fraught with moral complexity. Some women chose to continue pregnancies despite terrible circumstances, asserting life in the face of death, refusing to let Germans determine whether Jewish children would be born. Others sought abortions, recognizing that bringing children into such suffering was cruel, that pregnancy and childbirth depleted bodies that had nothing left to give. The doctors who performed abortions did so secretly because the procedure was technically illegal, though the illegality seemed absurd when every aspect of existence violated normal legal and moral frameworks. Mental illness increased dramatically under ghetto conditions, predictable responses to impossible circumstances. Depression became epidemic, people losing the will to continue, stopping eating even when food was available, simply giving up the struggle for survival. Some called it ghetto disease, a psychological condition distinct from clinical depression, characterized by apathy and withdrawal and loss of survival instinct. No treatment existed beyond human connection and attempt to provide reasons for continuing, but human connection was difficult when everyone was traumatized and reasons for continuing grew harder to identify as conditions deteriorated. Suicide rates varied across ghettos, but everywhere represented a significant cause of death. Some people jumped from buildings, quick deaths preferable to slow starvation. Others hoarded sleeping pills or other medications when available, choosing exit strategies that offered some control over timing and method. Some walked deliberately toward German checkpoints and refused to stop when ordered, suicide by guard that accomplished the same end. The Jewish religious prohibition against suicide created additional anguish for those considering it, adding spiritual crisis to physical and psychological suffering. The collection of bodies became one of the ghetto's most essential and most horrifying daily tasks. Each morning brought new corpses, people who had died during the night from starvation or disease, or simply giving up. The bodies appeared on sidewalks, left outside by families who had no space for them inside, no means to arrange burial, no energy to carry them to the cemetery. The burial society operated carts that made rounds through ghetto streets. workers loading bodies that had often been stripped of clothes by desperate people who needed fabric more than corpses did. The cemeteries filled faster than anyone had anticipated. Graves were dug as efficiently as possible, multiple bodies in single plots to conserve space, burial rites simplified because time and resources didn't exist for traditional practices. Rabbis conducted abbreviated services or no services at all, just blessings whispered over hastily covered graves. The cemetery workers, exposed constantly to dead bodies and the diseases that had killed them, faced their own elevated health risks, but continued working because bodies had to be disposed of somehow, and burial was preferable to the alternatives that would emerge if corpses accumulated. Mass graves became necessary when individual burials couldn't keep pace with death rates. Large pits were excavated, bodies placed in layers, lime sprinkled between them to accelerate decomposition and reduce smell. The process felt obscene, violating Jewish burial traditions that prescribed individual graves and specific rituals, but practicality overrode tradition when dealing with death on industrial scale. Some families never learned exactly where their loved ones were buried. The cemetery records inadequate for tracking individual remains in mass graves that held dozens or hundreds. The psychological impact of constant exposure to death shaped everyone in the ghettos, but particularly affected those whose work required direct contact with the dead and dying. Doctors and nurses developed emotional numbness, protective detachment, that allowed them to continue functioning when surrounded by suffering they couldn't relieve. Burial society workers spoke of their job in matter-of-fact terms, bodies becoming objects to be processed rather than people to be mourned. The psychological cost of this detachment was high, but necessary, because the alternative was emotional collapse that would prevent essential work from continuing. Children's exposure to death marked them permanently. They saw bodies daily, stepped over them on the way to school or work, grew accustomed to death as background reality rather than traumatic exception. Some became desensitized, death losing its power to shock or disturb. Others developed anxieties and nightmares that persisted long after liberation, images of dead bodies haunting their sleep for decades. The normalization of death in childhood shaped how survivors later understood mortality and valued life and processed grief when loss came in more normal contexts. The Germans documented ghetto mortality with meticulous statistical precision, tracking death rates by age and cause, compiling data that revealed the effectiveness of their policies in achieving population reduction. The statistics showed exactly what they were designed to show, that ghetto conditions successfully killed people through disease and starvation without requiring direct German action. The deaths could be attributed to overcrowding or poor hygiene or other factors that implied Jewish responsibility rather than German policy, maintaining plausible deniability about systematic murder disguised as public health management. Dr. Hirschfeld and his colleagues understood what the statistics represented, recognized that they were witnessing and documenting crimes against humanity, even while lacking power to prevent them. They continued their medical work with dedication that bordered on heroic, treating patients they knew they couldn't save, maintaining professional standards in circumstances that made professional medicine nearly impossible, honoring the principle that every life mattered even when German policy declared that Jewish lives had no value at all. By 1942, as deportations began and the final phase of the Nazi plan became clear, the nature of death in the ghettos shifted. Disease and starvation continued killing thousands, but now they were joined by something more efficient and more final. The trains arrived at collection points, cattle cars waiting to transport ghetto populations to destinations whose names most had never heard. Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. These were not labor camps or resettlement areas. They were factories built specifically for killing, designed to process human beings into corpses with industrial efficiency. The logical conclusion of policies that had begun with walls and starvation and disease, but had always intended to end with total extermination. The ghettos had successfully concentrated and weakened populations, prepared them for the final stage that would transform the slow death of disease into the rapid death of gas chambers. completing the arc from isolation to annihilation that had been planned from the beginning. Chapter 10. The deportations begin. July 22nd, 1942. The morning started like every other morning in the Warsaw Ghetto. People leaving for work details, children playing in courtyards despite hunger, smugglers preparing for dangerous runs across the walls. Then the posters appeared, plastered on buildings and walls throughout the ghetto, printed in German and Polish and Yiddish so no one could claim misunderstanding. All Jewish persons regardless of age or sex will be resettled in the East. 6,000 people daily, beginning immediately. Exceptions existed for certain categories: workers in German factories, hospital staff, Judenrat members and their families, Jewish police. Everyone else was to report voluntarily to the Umschlagplatz, the collection point near the freight station, bringing 15 kilograms of possessions and food for the journey. The word used was resettlement. Umsiedlung in German. It sounded administrative, bureaucratic, perhaps even hopeful. The East meant occupied Soviet territories where labor was needed for the war effort. People would work in factories or on farms. Harsh conditions, certainly, but survivable, better than slow starvation in the ghetto. The posters promised that families could stay together, that adequate food would be provided, that this was a rational reorganization of populations to serve economic needs. Some people wanted to believe this narrative because the alternative was unthinkable. Resettlement meant displacement and hardship. The alternative meant something for which no proper words existed yet, something the human mind resisted accepting, because accepting meant confronting evil of unprecedented scope. But some knew the truth, or suspected it strongly enough to act on their suspicions. Information had been filtering back through underground networks for months about camps in the East that weren't labor facilities. Chelmno had been operating since December 1941, using mobile gas vans to murder Jews from the Lodz region and surrounding areas. Belzec opened in March 1942, Sobibor in May, both purpose-built killing centers disguised as transit camps. Reports about these places came from Polish resistance fighters, from railway workers who saw trains arrive full and leave empty, from rare escapees who had witnessed mass murder and fled to warn others. The Jewish Fighting Organization, the ZOB, had formed earlier that year, a resistance group composed mainly of young people from various political movements who had concluded that armed resistance was both necessary and morally imperative. They distributed leaflets countering the resettlement narrative, warning that deportation meant death, urging people to resist or hide rather than report voluntarily. But their message competed against powerful psychological forces that made denial easier than acceptance. Believing the resettlement story meant hope for survival, for keeping families together, for escaping ghetto conditions that had become unbearable. Believing the resistance warnings meant accepting that death was imminent and certain, that there was no escape, that the Germans intended to murder everyone regardless of age or health or usefulness. Adam Cherniakow, chairman of the Judenrat, spent July 22nd and 23rd in frantic negotiations with German authorities. He begged for exemptions, particularly for children, for the orphanages he had worked to protect. The Germans refused every request. Children would be deported with adults. No exceptions beyond the narrow categories already specified. On the morning of July 23rd, Cherniakow returned to his office, wrote brief notes to his wife and colleagues, and swallowed a cyanide capsule. His suicide was protest and escape simultaneously, a refusal to participate in what he now understood was mass murder, but also an abandonment of those who remained to face the deportations without his leadership. The first deportations began within hours of the announcement. Jewish police, under German supervision, went building to building, pulling people from apartments, pushing them into the streets, forming columns that marched toward the Umschlagplatz. The police carried clubs and whips, but no firearms. German and Ukrainian guards surrounded the columns, rifles ready for anyone who tried to escape. The march through the ghetto streets was a horror show. People carrying bundles and children, elderly shuffled along by family members, everyone moving toward a destination they didn't truly understand. The Umschlagplatz itself, was a square near the freight station, surrounded by walls and guarded by armed men who shot anyone attempting to flee. The square filled with thousands of people pressed together in summer heat, without water or toilet facilities, waiting for trains that would arrive when Germans decided they were ready. Hours passed. Children cried. Old people collapsed. Some died while waiting. Their bodies left where they fell because there was nowhere to take them, and the living had to focus on surviving the next minutes and hours. The trains were cattle cars, freight wagons designed to transport animals or cargo, not human beings. Each car was packed with 100 or more people, far beyond any reasonable capacity. The Germans forced people in with rifle butts and clubs, pushing until no more bodies would fit, then sealing the doors from outside with bolts and bars. Small windows near the roof provided minimal ventilation. There were no seats, no toilets, no water. People stood pressed together so tightly that movement was impossible, breathing difficult, survival for the journey ahead questionable even before considering what waited at the destination. The journey to Treblinka took several hours, though people packed into the cattle cars had no way to track time, no windows to show landscape passing, no information about where they were going or how long the journey would take. The conditions inside the cars were beyond description. Heat built to unbearable levels. People fainted from lack of air. Children and elderly died during transit, their bodies remaining upright because there was no space for them to fall. Some people went mad from the horror and confinement, screaming or laughing hysterically. Others prayed, reciting psalms and traditional prayers, seeking comfort and faith when no physical comfort existed. Treblinka was located roughly 80 kilometers northeast of Warsaw, built in a forest clearing specifically to maximize secrecy and isolation. The camp had been constructed in spring and early summer of 1942 using forced Jewish labor, workers who were subsequently murdered to preserve the secret of what they had built. The design was simple and horrifically efficient. A railway siding led directly into the camp. A platform received arriving trains. From the platform, paths led through the camp to gas chambers disguised as showers. The entire process, from arrival to death, took approximately 2 hours for groups of 1,000 or more people. The deception continued until the final moments. When trains arrived and doors were opened, SS guards shouted that this was a transit camp, that everyone would shower and be deloused before proceeding to labor assignments. People were ordered to undress, told to remember where they left their belongings so they could reclaim them after showering. Some believed this narrative because believing meant hope. Others suspected the truth, but had no options, no weapons, no strength after the journey to resist guards with rifles and dogs. The path to the gas chambers was called the tube, a fence corridor that prevented escape and channeled people toward the building where they would die. The chambers themselves were small rooms, perhaps 25 square meters each, into which hundreds of people were forced. When the chambers were packed beyond capacity, the doors were sealed and engines started that pumped carbon monoxide into the sealed spaces. Death took approximately 20 minutes, sometimes longer if the engines malfunctioned or if the gas concentration was lower than optimal. The bodies were removed by Jewish prisoners forced to work in the camp, a special unit called the Sonderkommando who lived in separate barracks and performed the tasks no German wanted to do. They extracted bodies from gas chambers, searched them for hidden valuables, pulled gold teeth from mouths, cut hair that would be sold to German factories. Then they carried bodies to mass graves, enormous pits where hundreds of thousands would eventually be buried. The Sonderkommando lived with knowledge that their own deaths were certain, that they were kept alive only as long as they remained useful, that eventually they too would be murdered and replaced with workers selected from new arrivals. Back in the Warsaw Ghetto, the deportations continued at the mandated rate of 6,000 daily. The Umschlagplatz filled and emptied and filled again, a constant cycle that consumed the ghetto population block by block, building by building, family by family. The Jewish police who conducted the roundups worked with varying degrees of enthusiasm or reluctance. Some beat people savagely, enjoying the small power they held. Others tried to be gentle while still fulfilling quotas that determined their own survival. All of them lived with the knowledge that they were sending people to death, that cooperation made them complicit, but that refusal meant joining the deportees on the next train. The Germans added incentives to encourage voluntary reporting. People who came to the Umschlagplatz without being rounded up received 3 kilograms of bread and 1 kilogram of marmalade, provisions that represented weeks of normal rations. For people who hadn't eaten adequately in months, the bread was tempting beyond measure. Entire families reported voluntarily, trading their lives for a few days of feeling full, choosing death by deception over slow starvation in the ghetto. The Germans understood human desperation with precision, knew exactly which pressures would make people complicit in their own destruction. As July turned to August, and the deportations continued relentlessly, the character of ghetto life changed completely. Streets emptied as populations were removed. Entire neighborhoods became ghost zones, apartments abandoned with possessions still inside, evidence of lives interrupted mid-sentence. The remaining population grew increasingly desperate, people hiding in attics and cellars, and anywhere they might avoid the searches that came daily. The infrastructure of normal life collapsed completely. Schools closed permanently. Hospitals were raided and patients deported directly from beds. Orphanages were emptied. Children marched to the Umschlagplatz despite their protests and tears. Emanuel Ringelblum, the historian documenting ghetto life through the Oneg Shabbat archive, wrote frantically during these weeks, trying to record everything, understanding that this was the final chapter of Warsaw Jewish life, and that documentation was essential. His archive entries from summer 1942 conveyed desperation and determination, a man watching his world being destroyed while trying to preserve evidence for a future that might never come. He and his collaborators buried additional portions of the archive as deportations continued, hiding the truth underground where it might survive even if the authors did not. The selections became increasingly arbitrary and cruel as August progressed. Initially, the Germans had promised exemptions for workers and their families, for hospital staff, for Judenrat members. But the promises meant nothing. Workers were seized from factories. Hospital staff were taken during raids. Judenrat members discovered that their positions provided no ultimate protection. The only category that consistently received protection was the Jewish police and their immediate families, a privilege that deepened the resentment and hatred directed toward them by the remaining population. By September, when the Great Action finally ended, over 300,000 people had been deported from Warsaw, the vast majority murdered at Treblinka within hours of arrival. The ghetto that had held nearly 500,000 people in spring 1942 now held perhaps 60,000, mainly young workers in German factories who had survived through combinations of luck and privilege and desperate maneuvering. The community that had existed before was gone, destroyed so completely that its reconstruction would be impossible even if every survivor somehow returned. The truth about Treblinka became undeniable during this period. Escapees from the camp reached Warsaw and told their stories to anyone who would listen. Railway workers reported seeing trains arrive full and return empty. Polish resistance provided information from sources near the camp. By late summer, even those who had wanted to believe the resettlement narrative could no longer sustain that illusion. The knowledge spread through the remaining ghetto population, a terrible certainty that deportation meant death, that the Germans intended to murder everyone, that cooperation was collaboration in mass murder. This knowledge changed everything for those who remained. The question was no longer how to survive the ghetto, but whether to resist the inevitable end, whether to fight back with whatever weapons could be obtained or hidden, whether to die fighting rather than in gas chambers, whether individual deaths in battle might be preferable to cooperative extinction. The young people in the resistance movements had been preparing for this moment, stockpiling weapons obtained through elaborate smuggling operations, training in combat tactics, organizing into fighting units. They had known before most others what was coming, and they had decided that if death was certain, how you died still mattered. The deportations from Warsaw were not unique, but rather the model that would be repeated across occupied Poland through late 1942 and 1943. Łódź's turn would come later, the ghetto surviving in 1944 because Chaim Rumkowski's strategy of productivity convinced German administrators that the workshops were valuable enough to preserve temporarily. But the other ghettos faced liquidation on similar timelines. Lublin was emptied in March and April. Krakow's liquidation came in waves through 1942 and early 1943. The smaller ghettos disappeared even faster, entire communities loaded onto trains and murdered within days. The deportations represented the transition from the initial phase of Nazi anti-Jewish policy, which had focused on concentration and exploitation and death through starvation and disease, to the final phase, which was systematic immediate murder of entire populations regardless of age or productivity. The ghettos had served their purpose, concentrating Jews in controllable locations, weakening them physically and psychologically, preparing them for transport to killing centers that had been constructed specifically to murder them efficiently. What happened in summer and fall of 1942 was the beginning of the end, the moment when the machinery designed over years of planning began operating at full capacity, processing human beings into corpses at rates previously unimaginable, pursuing the goal of making Europe Judenfrei, free of Jews, through murder conducted with industrial efficiency and bureaucratic precision. Chapter 11. Armed Resistance Takes Shape. The meeting took place in a basement on Zielna Street in late July 1942, just days after the deportations had begun. 23 young people sat in a circle on the floor, their faces lit by a single candle because electricity had been cut. They ranged in age from 17 to 25, members of various youth movements that had spent years in ideological opposition to each other. Socialists and Zionists, communists and religious activists, groups that had debated and argued and competed for members in the years before the war. But the deportations had dissolved those old divisions, replaced them with a single urgent question that united everyone in that basement. Would they go to their deaths passively, or would they fight back even though fighting meant certain death, perhaps sooner than deportation would bring it? Mordecai Anielewicz was 23 years old, a member of As Homer Hatzer, a socialist Zionist youth movement that had prepared its members for agricultural settlement in Palestine, not for urban warfare in a sealed ghetto. He was slight and soft-spoken, not physically imposing, not the kind of person who seemed destined for military leadership. But he possessed qualities that mattered more in the circumstances they faced: absolute clarity about their situation, unwavering determination to resist, and the ability to inspire others to follow him into battles they knew they couldn't win. He argued that night for the formation of a unified fighting organization, pooling the limited resources all the movements had been secretly accumulating, training together, preparing for the moment when resistance would become possible. The arguments against fighting were substantial and came from people whose concerns deserved serious consideration. Armed resistance would bring brutal reprisals against the remaining ghetto population. The Germans would respond to any attack with mass executions, collective punishment that would kill innocents who had no connection to the fighters. The weapons available were pathetically inadequate for confronting a military force with tanks and artillery and air support. A few pistols and homemade explosives couldn't defeat the Wehrmacht. Resistance would accelerate the total destruction of the ghetto, bring the end sooner rather than later. Better to preserve life as long as possible, to survive until the war ended and the Germans were defeated by Allied armies, than to provoke destruction through futile resistance. But Anielewicz and those who thought like him had concluded that survival through passivity was an illusion. The deportations proved that German intentions were total annihilation, not exploitation or indefinite ghettoization. Everyone would be killed eventually regardless of cooperation or compliance. The only question was whether they would die passively in gas chambers or actively fighting back. Even if resistance couldn't prevent the ultimate outcome, it would demonstrate that Jews had not accepted their fate meekly, that the stereotype of passive victims was false, that some had chosen to resist with whatever means available, even when resistance seemed hopeless. The organization formed that night took the name Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, the Jewish Fighting Organization, known by its Polish acronym ZOB. Anielewicz became its commander, though leadership was relatively collective in those early days. Decisions made through discussion and consensus among representatives from the various movements. The ZOB's first task was acquiring weapons, a challenge of staggering difficulty in a sealed ghetto where Germans controlled every entry point and searched everyone passing through gates. The weapons had to come from outside, purchased from Polish sources, or smuggled in through the elaborate underground networks that had been moving food and contraband for years. The ZOB made contact with the Polish Home Army, the largest resistance organization in occupied Poland, requesting weapons and support. The response was disappointing and revealing. The Home Army provided minimal assistance, a handful of pistols and rifles, nothing approaching what would be needed for sustained combat. Whether this reflected Polish anti-Semitism, skepticism about Jewish fighting capability, or simply the Home Army's own limited resources was debated then and remains controversial in historical memory. Other weapons came through purchases on the black market, transactions that required money the resistance movement scraped together through donations and confiscation of funds from wealthy ghetto residents who were essentially taxed by the underground. A single pistol cost astronomical sums, a rifle even more, prices that reflected both scarcity and the danger sellers faced if caught providing weapons to Jews. The German penalty for selling weapons to Jews was death, so the markup included compensation for existential risk. Some weapons were manufactured within the ghetto using materials smuggled in or salvaged from unlikely sources. Molotov cocktails were relatively simple to produce, requiring only bottles and flammable liquid and cloth for wicks. The explosives were more complex, requiring chemical knowledge and ingredients that had to be obtained through elaborate smuggling operations. A few members had military experience from service in Polish or other armies before the war. They taught basic weapons handling and combat tactics to young people who had never held a gun, transforming poets and students and factory workers into soldiers preparing for battles they had no realistic hope of surviving. The training happened in secret locations throughout the ghetto, basements and attics where groups could gather without attracting attention. The sessions covered weapons maintenance and basic marksmanship, though actual firing practice was impossible because gunshots would bring immediate German response. They studied urban combat tactics, how to use buildings for cover, how to move through ruins, how to maximize defensive advantages when facing superior forces. They discussed strategy and morale, and the psychological preparation required to fight knowing that death was certain. The psychological dimension of preparation was perhaps most challenging. Training someone to fire a weapon is relatively straightforward. Training someone to fire that weapon knowing they will die shortly afterward, that their death will accomplish nothing except demonstrating defiance, requires different preparation entirely. The fighters had to confront their own mortality, accept it, move beyond acceptance to a place where death became less important than the manner of dying. Some found this easier than others. Some were motivated by rage at what had been done to their families and communities. Others were driven by ideology, by belief that resistance served higher purposes even if it didn't ensure survival. The relationship between the ZOB and the remaining ghetto population was complicated and evolved over time. Initially, many ghetto residents viewed the resistance as dangerous extremists whose actions would bring German reprisals on everyone. The deportations were terrible, the thinking went, but antagonizing the Germans would make things worse for those trying to survive through compliance and invisibility. The Jewish police, who served German interests, actively worked against the resistance, trying to identify fighters and confiscate weapons and prevent the organization from growing. But as summer turned to fall in 1942 and the scope of the deportations became undeniable, attitudes shifted. The ZOB gained credibility as their warnings about the true nature of deportation proved accurate, while Judenrat assurances about resettlement were revealed as lies or desperate delusions. When the ZOB executed Yosef Sarinsky, the Jewish police commander who had overseen the deportation of hundreds of thousands, The action was celebrated by many who had lost family members to the transports. The attempted assassination failed to kill Serinsky, but demonstrated that the resistance was capable of action, that collaboration carried risks, that not everyone accepted German authority as absolute. The resistance established an intelligence network that gathered information about German movements and plans. Young women, who could move more freely than men and drew less suspicion, served as couriers between different parts of the ghetto and between the ghetto and contacts on the Aryan side. They carried messages and weapons and money, risking death if caught, playing essential roles in the resistance infrastructure. Names like Zivia Lebetkin and Toja Altman became legendary among fighters for their courage and effectiveness in operations that required passing through checkpoints where discovery meant immediate execution. In January 1943, the Germans attempted a second wave of deportations, planning to remove the remaining population in a final liquidation of the ghetto. But this time they encountered something unexpected. When German and Ukrainian forces entered the ghetto on January 18th to begin roundups, ZOB fighters engaged them with gunfire. The shooting was brief and chaotic, a few pistols against rifles and machine guns, but it was enough to surprise the Germans and disrupt their plans. The deportation action was suspended after 4 days instead of continuing until the ghetto was emptied completely. The January action was not a victory in any conventional military sense. Dozens of fighters were killed. Several thousand people were still deported and murdered. But the psychological impact was enormous. The ZOB had fought back and survived. The Germans had retreated, if only temporarily. The myth of German invincibility was fractured. The possibility of resistance, of dying with weapons in hand rather than naked in gas chambers, became real rather than theoretical. The 4 months between January and April 1943 became a period of intensive preparation for the final battle everyone knew was coming. The ZOB expanded its membership, recruiting fighters from among the remaining population that now largely supported armed resistance. Weapons acquisition accelerated, though the arsenal remained pathetically small compared to what would be needed. The fighters prepared defensive positions, identifying buildings that could be fortified, planning fighting positions and escape routes and supply caches. The ghetto itself was transformed during this period, the physical space reorganized for combat. Buildings were connected through holes broken in walls, creating paths of movement invisible from the streets. Bunkers were constructed underground, hidden spaces where people could shelter during fighting or hide from searches. Rooftops became observation and fighting positions. The ZOB divided the ghetto into sectors, assigning fighting groups to each with specific defensive responsibilities. A parallel organization formed alongside the ZOB, the Zydowski Związek Wojskowy, or Jewish Military Union, known as ZZW. This group was smaller and politically right-wing, composed mainly of Betar members, the revisionist Zionist youth movement founded by Vladimir Jabotinsky. Relations between ZOB and ZZW were sometimes tense, ideological differences persisting even in extremity, but both organizations shared the fundamental commitment to armed resistance. They coordinated to some degree while maintaining separate command structures and operational independence. The preparations included psychological readiness for the final battle that would be both last stand and memorial. The fighters wrote letters to be smuggled out and delivered after the war if possible, testaments explaining their choices, messages to families and friends who might survive, documents for history. They understood that their resistance might fail to save lives but could succeed in shaping memory, in ensuring that future generations would know that some had fought back, that Jews had not gone passively to death, that even in the most hopeless circumstances human dignity could be asserted through resistance. The mood in the ghetto during these months mixed despair and determination in ways difficult to capture. Everyone knew the end was coming. The remaining population was perhaps 60,000, down from nearly 500,000 just months earlier. Food was scarce even by ghetto standards. German patrols and searches were constant. Death could come at any moment from disease or starvation or random violence. Yet the presence of organized resistance provided meaning that transcended survival. The young people training for battle gave hope to those who wouldn't fight directly, demonstrated that Jewish agency still existed, that Germans hadn't achieved total domination. The spiritual preparation was as important as the tactical. Rabbis debated whether armed resistance was permissible under Jewish law, whether fighting back violated prohibitions against suicide or endangered others through bringing reprisals. Most concluded that the principle of pikwach nefesh, preservation of life, justified resistance even if individual lives would be lost, because resistance might save some even if it couldn't save all. Religious fighters found ways to maintain observance while preparing for battle, praying with weapons at their sides, seeking divine support for actions that violated norms of peacetime morality. As Passover approached in April 1943, intelligence reports indicated that German forces were assembling for a final liquidation of the ghetto. The holiday commemorating the exodus from Egypt, the story of liberation from slavery and escape from pursuing armies, will be celebrated this year with actual battle rather than symbolic reenactment. The fighters prepared positions and checked weapons and said goodbyes to those who wouldn't fight alongside them, but would shelter in bunkers and hope to survive whatever was coming. On April 19th, the first night of Passover, German forces began assembling at ghetto gates. 2,000 SS and Wehrmacht troops, supported by Polish and Ukrainian auxiliaries, prepared to enter the ghetto and complete its destruction. They expected minimal resistance, a few hours of rounding up the remaining population for transport to Treblinka. They carried rifles and machine guns and artillery, overwhelming force for dealing with whatever opposition might emerge. But waiting for them behind the walls were several hundred young people with pistols and Molotov cocktails and homemade explosives, fighters who had spent 4 months preparing for this moment, who had already decided that they would die, but had not yet determined how many of the enemy they could take with them, how long they could hold out, how much pain they could inflict before the inevitable end arrived. Chapter 12. Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The morning of April 19th, 1943, began with the rumble of boots and trucks assembling outside the ghetto walls. Sounds that had become familiar during previous deportation actions, but carried different weight now, because everyone knew this was the end, the final liquidation that would empty the ghetto completely. Dawn was just breaking when German forces began entering through the main gates. Over 2,000 SS and Wehrmacht troops, supported by Polish police and Ukrainian auxiliaries, tanks and armored vehicles rolling through streets that had been emptied of civilians overnight. The Germans expected minimal resistance, perhaps a few hours of rounding up the remaining population for transport to Treblinka. What they encountered instead was something unprecedented in the history of Nazi occupation: sustained, armed Jewish resistance. The first shots came from a building on Lublin Street. ZOB fighters positioned at windows, firing down on the column of German troops advancing into the ghetto. The gunfire was shocking not for its volume or accuracy, but for its mere existence. Jews weren't supposed to fight back. Centuries of persecution had supposedly conditioned them to passivity, to accepting suffering without resistance. But the young people firing from those windows had rejected that narrative, chosen to write a different story, even though the ending was already determined. The Germans fell back under fire, a tactical retreat that was militarily insignificant, but psychologically devastating. The SS troops who had spent years terrorizing unarmed civilians now faced opponents shooting back, causing casualties, forcing them to take cover. The ZOB had perhaps one pistol for every 10 or 15 fighters, a few hundred weapons total against an enemy with unlimited ammunition and artillery support. But those first hours demonstrated that determination could partially compensate for material disadvantage, that urban terrain favored defenders who knew the ground, that morale mattered even in hopeless circumstances. Mordecai and Neil Wicks commanded the ZOB from a bunker on Mila Street, coordinating through runners who moved between fighting positions because there was no other communication system. He was 24 years old, leading an army of teenagers and young adults in a battle that military science suggested couldn't be fought, shouldn't be attempted, served no rational purpose. But rationality applied only to situations where survival was possible. When survival was already foreclosed by enemy intention, different calculations applied. The question wasn't how to win, but how to die, and dying while fighting seemed infinitely preferable to dying in a gas chamber. The fighting that first day followed patterns that would repeat throughout the uprising. German forces would advance into the ghetto, moving cautiously because the previous easy dominance no longer applied. ZOB fighters would engage from fortified positions in buildings, firing until their limited ammunition required repositioning. Molotov cocktails were thrown from rooftops onto vehicles below, incendiary weapons that could destroy trucks and tanks if thrown accurately. The Germans would return fire with overwhelming force, machine guns and artillery reducing buildings to rubble. Then both sides would pause, Germans regrouping, fighters relocating to new positions through passages connecting buildings that appeared separate from outside. SS Brigadefuhrer Jürgen Stroop assumed command of the German forces on the second day of fighting, brought in to resolve what had become embarrassing for Nazi leadership. A ghetto that was supposed to be liquidated in hours was still resisting after a full day. Stroop brought reinforcements and new tactics, understanding that conventional military assault was inefficient when the enemy melted away before you could engage decisively. He ordered systematic destruction of the ghetto, building by building, using fire as the primary weapon because fire didn't require exposing troops to defensive fire, and it forced defenders out of positions that couldn't be held when surrounded by flames. The burning of the ghetto began in earnest on the third day. German forces used flamethrowers and incendiary shells, setting buildings ablaze methodically, working block by block to create an inferno that consumed everything flammable. The ZOB had anticipated fire as a German tactic, but couldn't adequately defend against it. You can't shoot flames. You can't throw explosives at heat and smoke. The only response was retreat, abandoning positions that became uninhabitable, moving to buildings not yet burning, knowing that those too would burn eventually. The smoke could be seen from across Warsaw, a pillar of black and gray rising above the ghetto walls, visible evidence that something unprecedented was happening. On the Aryan side, Poles gathered to watch the fire, some with satisfaction, some with horror, some with the indifference that had characterized much Polish response to Jewish suffering throughout the occupation. A few Poles helped, providing weapons or information or safe houses for fighters who managed to escape through sewers. But most watched passively as the ghetto burned, an entire community being erased in flames and violence, just blocks from where normal life continued. The fighters adapted to the burning city by moving underground, using sewers and bunkers as the surface became uninhabitable. The sewer system that had served smuggling operations for years now became a military asset, allowing movement between positions without exposure to German observation or fire. The sewers were dark and filled with waste and poisonous gases, but they provided routes that German forces couldn't easily follow or block. Fighters emerged from manholes to attack German positions, then disappeared back underground before reinforcements could arrive. Marek Edelman, a young Bund activist who commanded one of the ZOB fighting groups, later described the experience of combat in the burning ghetto as surreal beyond description. You would be fighting in a building when suddenly the walls would be on fire around you. You would retreat through passages prepared for exactly this eventuality, emerging into courtyards filled with smoke so thick you couldn't see your own hands. You would hear German voices shouting orders and gunfire echoing from all directions, and the screams of people burning alive in buildings that had become furnaces. You would taste ash and smell burning flesh, and feel heat that made breathing painful. And through it all you would continue fighting, because fighting was the purpose, resistance itself the victory regardless of tactical outcomes. The civilian population trapped in the ghetto during the fighting faced impossible choices. The bunkers that had been constructed to hide from German searches now became death traps when Germans discovered them and pumped in poison gas, or simply sealed the exits and left the occupants to suffocate or starve. Thousands of people hid in these underground spaces, entire families crowded together in darkness. hoping to outlast the German action above ground. But the Germans were methodical, using dogs and listening devices to locate bunkers, then forcing occupants out through gas or smoke or flooding. When bunkers were discovered and opened, German forces would sometimes offer the occupants a choice: come out voluntarily for deportation, or die inside when we seal this space permanently. It was a choice between certain death now or a likely death later, but the human survival instinct made many choose the possibility of later, even when logic suggested immediate might be preferable. Thousands emerged from bunkers and were marched to the Umschlagplatz, loaded onto the same cattle cars that had taken previous deportees to Treblinka, transported to murder that came within hours of arrival. The ZZW, the Jewish Military Union, fought with equal determination from their positions in the Muranowski Square area. This group had better weapons than the ZOB, having received more support from sources that remain disputed in historical accounts. They raised a Polish flag and a blue and white Zionist flag over one of their positions, visible symbols that defiance continued despite German attempts at suppression. The flags flew for several days, photographed by German propagandists who wanted documentation of the uprising they were suppressing, but inadvertently created images that would later serve Jewish memory as symbols of resistance. Stroop reported daily to his superiors in detailed dispatches that would survive the war and become crucial historical documents. He described the fighting with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect, noting that Jews were defending positions with determination that German troops might admire if the defenders weren't subhuman in Nazi ideology. His reports documented casualties on both sides, buildings destroyed, bunkers discovered, resistance encountered and overcome. He wrote with bureaucratic precision about destroying what he called bandits and terrorists, language that dehumanized the fighters, but couldn't conceal the fact that they had fought back effectively against vastly superior forces. The fighting raged for days that turned into weeks, far longer than any German planner had anticipated. The timetable for liquidating the ghetto had projected hours, or perhaps a few days. But 3 weeks after the uprising began, resistance continued in pockets throughout the burning ruins. The ZOB and ZZW fighters, reduced in number as casualties mounted, still held positions and attacked German patrols and refused surrender. The determination was remarkable and from a military perspective irrational because the outcome was never in doubt. Yet the fighters persisted because the act of resistance mattered independent of results. Ammunition became critically scarce as the battle continued. Fighters who started with 10 or 15 bullets fired their last rounds and then fought with knives and clubs and stones, with whatever could serve as weapons. Some used captured German weapons when they could retrieve them from casualties, but this required exposing yourself to enemy fire to reach a fallen soldier and take his rifle. The improvised explosives that had been effective early in the uprising were mostly depleted, the materials for making more impossible to obtain when the ghetto was sealed and burning. Food and water became as critical as ammunition. The infrastructure that had barely sustained ghetto life was completely destroyed by the fighting and fires. Wells were buried under rubble or contaminated. Food stores that had existed were consumed by flames or captured when bunkers fell. People in hiding survived by eating whatever they could find, sometimes nothing for days, their bodies already weakened by years of malnutrition, now pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Fighters continued operating while literally starving, running on will when physical reserves were exhausted. The psychological toll was devastating even for those who had prepared mentally for sacrifice. Watching comrades die, seeing civilians pulled from bunkers and executed, witnessing the total destruction of the community you were fighting to defend, all of this accumulated into trauma that would mark survivors permanently. Some fighters broke under the strain, unable to continue, seeking death rather than enduring more combat. Others found reserves of determination that surprised them, discovering they could function beyond what they believed were their limits. Communication with the outside world was maintained sporadically through couriers who moved through sewers to the Aryan side, carrying messages and bringing back whatever supplies could be smuggled in. These couriers, Mostly young women who could move with less suspicion, risked their lives repeatedly to maintain the link between the ghetto resistance and Polish underground organizations. The information they carried out allowed the wider world to learn what was happening, though the world's response was muted, expressions of sympathy, but little concrete support. On May 8, 1943, German forces discovered the ZOB headquarters bunker on Mila Street. The bunker held approximately 100 people, fighters and civilians who had been sheltering there. The Germans pumped smoke into the bunker, making it uninhabitable. Mordecai Anielewicz died there, either from the smoke or by his own hand. Accounts vary, but the outcome was identical. He was 24 years old, had led the resistance for less than a year, would be remembered for centuries. His death didn't end the fighting immediately, but marked the beginning of the final phase. The last organized resistance ended around May 16th, though individual fighters continued attacking German forces for several more days. Stroop declared the uprising crushed and celebrated by demolishing the Great Synagogue on Tłomacki Street, which was actually outside the ghetto walls, but served symbolically as representative of Jewish Warsaw. The explosion that destroyed the synagogue was documented photographically, Stroop's final gesture of triumph over what he'd crushed but never fully defeated. The casualty figures tell part of the story, but not its meaning. The Germans reported losing 16 dead and 85 wounded, numbers that seem small, but represented more casualties than Jews were supposed to inflict according to Nazi ideology. The Jewish dead numbered at least 7,000 killed during the fighting, and another 7,000 deported to Treblinka from capture bunkers. Tens of thousands more were sent to Majdanek and other labor camps, where most would die within months. The ghetto itself was completely destroyed, systematic demolition completing what fire had begun, leaving only rubble and ruins where hundreds of thousands had lived and suffered and died. But numbers fail to capture what the uprising meant then and continues to mean. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the first urban uprising against German occupation in all of occupied Europe. It demonstrated that Jews would fight back when given the slightest possibility, that the stereotype of passive victims was false propaganda rather than accurate description. It provided inspiration to Jewish resistance movements forming in other ghettos and to Allied forces who would later cite it as evidence that occupied populations would resist if supported. It ensured that when the Holocaust was remembered, Jews would be recalled not only as victims, but also as fighters who chose how they would die, even when they couldn't choose whether death would come. The fighters who survived, a few dozen who escaped through sewers to the Aryan side, carried the memory forward. They joined partisan units in forests or went into hiding with false papers, surviving to tell the story of 27 days when several hundred young people with inadequate weapons and no hope of military victory fought back against the machinery that had murdered millions. Their testimony would ensure that Mordecai Anielewicz and his fighters would be remembered not as footnotes, but as central figures in the story of how humanity responds when confronted with absolute evil, how dignity can be maintained even in extremity, how resistance matters even when it cannot prevent the terrible outcome that was planned from the beginning. Chapter 13. Other Acts of Defiance. The news from Warsaw traveled through underground networks with astonishing speed, whispered in bunkers and safe houses across occupied Poland and beyond, reaching ghettos where populations faced their own impending liquidations. The message was electrifying and terrible in equal measure. Jews had fought back in Warsaw. They had held out for nearly a month against overwhelming German force. They had all died or been captured, yes, but they had fought. The question that echoed through every remaining ghetto was whether others would follow their example, whether armed resistance could be replicated in places with even fewer weapons, less time to prepare, populations more thoroughly weakened by years of starvation and disease. Białystok was a city in northeastern Poland with a substantial Jewish population of approximately 50,000 before the war, reduced to perhaps 35,000 by the time of the ghetto's establishment in August 1941. The ghetto existed under relatively stable conditions through 1942, while Warsaw burned and other communities were liquidated, a temporary reprieve that provided false hope that perhaps this community would be spared. But in February 1943, deportations began, reducing the population to around 30,000. The news from Warsaw reached Białystok in April, just as the remaining community was beginning to understand that their turn was coming. The resistance organization in Białystok was led by Mordecai Tenenbaum, a young man who had actually visited the Warsaw Ghetto before the uprising, meeting with Anil Wicks and other ZOB leaders, discussing strategy and possibilities. He returned to Białystok determined to organize armed resistance, despite the material challenges being even more severe than Warsaw had faced. The acquisition of weapons was nearly impossible. Appeals to Soviet partisans operating in nearby forests produced minimal results. The Jewish community itself was divided about whether armed resistance made sense when it would certainly provoke German reprisals and accelerate the ghetto's destruction. On August 16, 1943, German forces began the final liquidation of the Białystok ghetto. Tenenbaum and his fighters, numbering perhaps 300 poorly armed individuals, engaged the Germans from prepared positions. The fighting was fierce but brief, lasting only a few days rather than the weeks that Warsaw had sustained. The resistance lacked the weapon stockpiles and fortified positions that had allowed Warsaw to hold out longer. But for those days, Jewish fighters in Białystok shot at German troops, threw explosives, defended positions until overrun, chose death in combat over deportation to Treblinka or Majdanek. Tenenbaum himself fell in the fighting, killed while defending a position on Białystok Street. His final words, reported by survivors, were a command to continue fighting, to not surrender, to ensure that Białystok would be remembered as a place where Jews resisted. The Germans crushed the uprising through overwhelming force and systematic burning of the ghetto, tactics that had proven effective in Warsaw. Most of the remaining population was deported and murdered. But the resistance had demonstrated that Warsaw's example could be followed, that Jews in different communities would reach the same conclusion about how to face inevitable death. Częstochowa, an industrial city in southern Poland, held a ghetto of approximately 40,000 Jews concentrated in a small area near the old city. Deportations in September and October 1942 reduced the population to about 5,000, mainly workers in German factories producing munitions. The small remaining community understood that they existed only as long as their labor served German interests, that eventual liquidation was certain. A resistance organization formed under the leadership of several young activists who had connections to underground networks providing weapons and training. When the final liquidation began in June 1943, the Częstochowa resistance engaged German forces with whatever weapons they had accumulated. The fighting was scattered and disorganized, individual groups attacking from different positions without the coordination that had characterized the Warsaw Uprising. But the attacks happened, Jewish fighters firing on German troops, disrupting the smooth efficiency the Nazis had come to expect from ghetto liquidations. The resistance was suppressed within days, the fighters killed or captured, the remaining population deported. But those days of fighting ensured that Częstochowa would be remembered alongside Warsaw and Białystok in the history of Jewish armed resistance. Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, faced its final liquidation in September 1943. The ghetto had already been partially emptied through earlier deportations and massacres at Ponary, the killing site outside the city where tens of thousands had been murdered. The resistance organization in Vilna, the Vernik Partisan Organizacji, or United Partisan Organization, was led by Abba Kovner, a young poet who had issued one of the earliest calls for armed resistance back in December 1941. His proclamation then had stated with prophetic clarity, "Let us not go like sheep to the slaughter." But when the final liquidation came, the Vilna resistance faced an agonizing choice. They could fight within the ghetto as Warsaw had done, engaging Germans in urban combat that would certainly result in their deaths, but might inflict casualties and demonstrate defiance. Or they could attempt to escape to the forests where partisan units operated, preserving fighters who might continue resistance and potentially survive to bear witness. Kovner and his comrades chose the forest option, attempting a mass escape through sewers and secret passages. The escape was only partially successful. Many fighters were killed during the attempt, but several dozen reached the forests and joined Soviet partisan units, continuing armed resistance until the area was liberated by Soviet forces in 1944. The choice between fighting in ghettos versus escaping to forests was debated in every resistance organization. Warsaw had chosen to fight where they were, to make their stand in the community they were defending. Vilna chose to preserve fighters for continued resistance elsewhere. Neither choice was clearly superior in moral or practical terms. Both involved sacrificing some people to potentially save others, accepting certain death for some to create possibility of survival, or continued fighting for others. The partisan route was available mainly in areas with forests near ghettos and where partisan units already operated. In eastern Poland and occupied Soviet territories, Jewish fighters who escaped ghettos could potentially join partisan groups. But the reception was often hostile. Soviet partisan units were frequently anti-Semitic, viewing Jewish fighters as unreliable or simply refusing to accept them. Some partisan commanders murdered Jewish fighters who sought to join them, taking their weapons and leaving bodies in the forest. Other units accepted Jews but treated them as expendable, assigning them to the most dangerous missions, denying them equal status with non-Jewish partisans. Despite these obstacles, thousands of Jews joined partisan units, fighting in forests across occupied Eastern Europe. They sabotaged railway lines, carrying German supplies. They attacked isolated German outposts. They gathered intelligence for Soviet forces. The Bielski partisans in Belarus, led by the Bielski brothers, created a unique model by establishing a forest camp that served both military and rescue purposes, taking in Jewish refugees from destroyed ghettos and protecting them while conducting partisan operations. Over 1,200 Jews survived the war under Bielski protection, the largest rescue operation conducted by Jews during the Holocaust. In Sobibor, one of the 3 Operation Reinhard death camps designed specifically for mass murder, resistance took a different form entirely. This was not a ghetto where people lived under occupation, but a killing center where prisoners faced immediate death upon arrival. A small number were temporarily spared to work in the camp, processing the possessions of murder victims and maintaining the facility. These prisoners, knowing their own deaths were inevitable once the Germans no longer needed their labor, organized an uprising for October 14, 1943. The Sobibor uprising was meticulously planned by a committee led by Leon Feldhendler, a Polish Jew who had been a community leader before the war, and Alexander Petrovsky, a Soviet Jewish soldier and prisoner of war who brought military experience to the planning. The plan involved killing SS guards individually and quietly, obtaining their weapons, then conducting a mass escape before the alarm could be raised. The execution was only partially successful. Some guards were killed as planned, but the alarm was raised before all preparations were complete. Still, approximately 300 prisoners escaped during the chaos, though many were recaptured or killed by German forces and local collaborators. About 50 survived the war, living witnesses to successful resistance in the heart of a death camp. Treblinka, the camp where Warsaw's Jews had been murdered, experienced its own uprising on August 2, 1943. The prisoners working in the camp, understanding that they existed only to process victims and would themselves be killed once the camp's mission was complete, organized a revolt. They managed to set buildings on fire and breach the perimeter fence. Approximately 200 escaped, though most were hunted down within days. Only a few dozen survived to liberation, their testimony providing crucial evidence about Treblinka's operations and the uprising that partially destroyed it. These camp uprisings differed fundamentally from ghetto resistance. In ghettos, fighters defended communities, protecting populations even when protection ultimately failed. In death camps, there were no communities to protect, only prisoners facing immediate murder who chose to die fighting rather than in gas chambers. The camp uprisings succeeded in ways ghetto uprisings couldn't, with some prisoners actually surviving to liberation. but they lacked the community dimension that gave ghetto resistance its particular character and meaning. The armed resistance in ghettos and camps represented only one form of Jewish defiance during the Holocaust. Resistance took many forms, not all of them armed. The documentation efforts of the Onyx Shabbat archive in Warsaw were resistance. The secret schools, teaching children in defiance of prohibitions, were resistance. The maintenance of cultural and religious life under conditions designed to destroy both was resistance. The survival itself was resistance when Germans intended universal death. But armed resistance held particular significance because it challenged the narrative that Jews went passively to their deaths, that they accepted victimization without fighting back. The stereotype of the passive Jew, reinforced by centuries of persecution and pogrom history, was a lie that Germans believed and that many Jews internalized. The uprisings demonstrated conclusively that Jews would fight when given the slightest opportunity, that the absence of widespread armed resistance reflected lack of weapons and organization and possibility rather than lack of will or courage. The debate about armed resistance continued during the war and persists in historical memory. Some argued then and argue now that armed resistance was counterproductive, that it provoked German reprisals killing people who might otherwise have survived, that the rational strategy was minimizing conflict and maximizing survival. Others countered that survival through passivity was an illusion given German intentions of total annihilation, that armed resistance provided the only way to die with dignity, even if it couldn't prevent death, that the moral and psychological value of fighting back exceeded any tactical disadvantages. The fighters themselves understood that their resistance served purposes beyond immediate military impact. They were fighting for Jewish honor, demonstrating that Jews could and would resist oppression. They were fighting for historical memory, ensuring that future generations would know that some had fought back. They were fighting for human dignity, asserting agency in circumstances designed to reduce people to helpless victims. They were fighting because fighting was better than not fighting, because death in combat was preferable to death in gas chambers, because resistance mattered independent of whether it achieved traditional military objectives. The cost of resistance was measured in lives lost during uprisings rather than in deportations, in communities destroyed weeks or months earlier than they might otherwise have been, in suffering inflicted on populations as collective punishment for fighters' actions. These costs were real and substantial, but the benefits were also real, if harder to quantify. The inspiration provided to other resistance movements. The evidence created that Jews would not accept their fate passively. The dignity maintained by those who fought. The memory preserved of courage under impossible circumstances. The women who participated in armed resistance have received less historical attention than their contributions deserved. They serve as couriers between resistance cells, carrying weapons and intelligence at great personal risk. They smuggled arms past checkpoints where men couldn't pass. They fought alongside men in uprisings, firing weapons and throwing explosives and defending positions until overrun. Names like Nina Teitelbaum, who assassinated German officials in Warsaw while passing as Aryan, and Havka Follman, who fought in the Białystok uprising, deserve remembrance alongside the male resistance leaders who dominate historical narratives. By the end of 1943, most of the ghettos in occupied Poland had been liquidated, their populations murdered in death camps or killed during the liquidation process itself. The few remaining ghettos existed only because they served German economic or strategic interests temporarily. The era of ghettos as sites of prolonged suffering was ending, replaced by the era of death camps as sites of immediate murder. But the resistance that had emerged in the final months of ghetto existence had established a legacy that would outlive the fighters themselves, proving that even in history's darkest moments, human beings retain the capacity to resist, to fight back, to assert dignity in the face of attempts to deny their humanity entirely. Chapter 14. Liquidation. The Łódź Ghetto stood alone in the summer of 1944, the last major ghetto still functioning in occupied Poland, an anachronism that had survived through a combination of economic utility and Chaim Rumkowski's desperate belief that productivity could purchase survival. Warsaw was gone, destroyed in the uprising more than a year earlier. Białystok was emptied. Vilna was liquidated. Krakow's ghetto existed only in memory and ruins. But Łódź continued operating its workshops and factories, producing goods for the German war effort. Rumkowski still convinced that making the ghetto indispensable would save his people, even as the evidence mounted that nothing would save anyone, that German intentions remained total annihilation regardless of economic value or cooperation. The illusion shattered in June 1944 when deportations resumed after months of relative stability. The Germans announced that workers and their families would be transferred to labor camps in Germany proper, presented as an evacuation ahead of the approaching Soviet forces that were pushing westward across Eastern Europe. The language was carefully chosen to suggest relocation rather than murder, using the same deceptive terminology that had accompanied every previous deportation action. But by mid-1944, few people still believed German promises about resettlement or labor assignments. The truth about the death camps was widely known among those who survived. The question was not what deportation meant, but whether resistance was possible or preferable to compliance. Rumkowski himself was placed in an impossible position one final time. The Germans demanded that he organize the deportations, that the Judenrat provide lists and facilitate the smooth transport of populations to the trains waiting at the railway station. He had spent 4 years implementing German orders, convinced that cooperation and productivity would ultimately save his community. Now he faced the final liquidation that proved his entire strategy had been built on false premises, that Germans had never intended to preserve the ghetto regardless of its economic output, that all his compromises and collaborations had merely delayed rather than prevented the inevitable outcome. The deportations from Łódź proceeded in waves through the summer of 1944. Unlike Warsaw's chaotic and violent liquidation, Łódź's end was more orderly. People boarding trains with luggage, and the thin hope that perhaps this time the destination really was a labor camp rather than a killing center. The trains went to Auschwitz, the massive camp complex that had evolved from a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners into the largest killing center in Nazi-occupied Europe. By 1944, Auschwitz had perfected the industrial murder that the Operation Reinhard camps had pioneered, processing thousands of victims daily through gas chambers designed to maximize efficiency. Chaim Rumkowski was deported in late August 1944, placed on a transport with his family and close associates. Accounts of his death vary, but most sources indicate he was murdered shortly after arrival at Auschwitz, either in the gas chambers or killed by prisoners who recognized him and blamed him for the deportations he had organized. His death ended one of the most controversial careers of the Holocaust. A man who had believed he could negotiate with absolute evil, who had thought that making himself useful would save his community, who had discovered too late that the only thing Germans valued about Jewish productivity was that it made Jews easier to control before killing them. The final transport left Łódź in August 1944, emptying the ghetto that had once held over 160,000 people. The city was liberated by Soviet forces in January 1945, troops finding abandoned buildings and empty streets, evidence of lives interrupted mid-sentence, possessions left behind by people who had believed or desperately hoped they might return. The Łódź ghetto had survived longer than any other major ghetto in Poland, lasting until the final year of the war, proving that longevity provided no protection, that temporary usefulness to Germans purchased only temporary survival, that the ultimate fate was always the same regardless of when it arrived. The smaller ghettos across occupied Eastern Europe faced liquidation on varying timelines through 1943 and 1944, each following the pattern established by the larger operations. German forces would surround the ghetto. Announcements would order the population to assemble for deportation or resettlement. Resistance organizations, when they existed, would face the agonizing choice between fighting and dying immediately or attempting escape to forests. Most populations, lacking organized resistance or weapons or any realistic hope of survival, complied with deportation orders because compliance at least offered the illusion of possibility, while resistance guaranteed immediate death. The Hungarian Jews faced their catastrophe later than most Eastern European communities, protected until 1944 by the Hungarian government's refusal to fully cooperate with German demands for deportation of its Jewish citizens. But in March 1944, Germany occupied Hungary directly, installing a puppet government willing to implement the final solution. The ghettoization of Hungary's Jewish population happened with stunning speed, hundreds of thousands forced in a hastily established ghettos in cities and towns across the country. The deportations began in May 1944 and proceeded with efficiency that shocked even experienced observers. 437,000 Hungarian Jews transported to Auschwitz in just 8 weeks. The speed and scale of the Hungarian deportations demonstrated how refined the Nazi killing apparatus had become by late in the war. The entire process from ghettoization to murder was compressed into weeks rather than years, the experience gained from earlier operations allowing Germans to streamline every stage. The deception was maintained through the final moments. Hungarian Jews told they were being resettled for labor. Families kept together during transport to encourage cooperation. The truth revealed only when they arrive at Auschwitz and face selection on the railway platform. The selections at Auschwitz divided arrivals into those deemed fit for labor and those sent immediately to gas chambers. The criteria were arbitrary and brutal. Young adults who appeared healthy might be selected for work, while children, elderly, pregnant women, and anyone who seemed weak were sent directly to death. Families were torn apart on the platform, mothers separated from children, husbands from wives, people making final eye contact with loved ones before being pushed in different directions, most never seeing each other again. The liquidation of the ghettos and occupied Soviet territories followed different patterns because many had been partially emptied through mass shootings before deportation infrastructure was established. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed the Wehrmacht into Soviet territory, had murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews in mass shooting operations during 1941 and 42. The survivors concentrated in remaining ghettos faced liquidation through both continued shooting operations and deportation to death camps established in occupied Poland. Minsk's ghetto was liquidated in September and October 1943 through a combination of mass shootings and deportations. The resistance organization that had been active throughout the ghetto's existence enabled thousands to escape to partisan units in surrounding forests. One of the few cases where a partisan escape was organized at scale and achieved significant success. But most of Minsk's Jewish population was murdered during the liquidation, either shot in mass graves or deported to Sobibor for gassing. Kovna's liquidation came in stages through 1943 and early 1944. The ghetto population reduced through selections and deportations until the final liquidation in July 1944. The Jewish Council chairman, Dr. Elkanan Elkis, died in Dachau concentration camp in October 1944, having survived long enough to document extensively the crimes he witnessed, but not long enough to see liberation or deliver his testimony directly to post-war courts. The process of liquidation involved more than just killing or deporting populations. It included the systematic erasure of physical evidence that ghettos and their inhabitants had ever existed. Buildings were demolished or repurposed. Documents were destroyed. Mass graves were excavated and bodies burned in operations designed to eliminate evidence of mass murder. The Germans understood that their crimes would be judged by history if history could access evidence. So they attempted to destroy that evidence as comprehensively as they destroyed the people themselves. Operation Reinhard, the code name for the systematic murder of Polish Jews, officially concluded in November 1943 with the murder of the last prisoners working at the death camps. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were dismantled, the gas chambers demolished, the mass graves excavated and bodies burned, the sites planted with trees and disguised as farms to conceal what had happened there. The camps had functioned for approximately 18 months, and murdered approximately 1.7 million people during that time, an industrial scale of killing unprecedented in human history. But even as the Operation Reinhard camps were being dismantled, Auschwitz continued expanding its capacity, becoming the primary killing center for Jews from across occupied Europe. The camp complex included Auschwitz I, the original concentration camp, Auschwitz II-Birkenau, the massive killing center with gas chambers and crematoria, and Auschwitz III Monowitz, a labor camp serving the IG Farben chemical works. The integration of concentration, extermination, and forced labor in a single complex represented the full development of the system that had begun with ghettos years earlier. The liquidation of the ghettos meant that by late 1944, the geography of Jewish life in Eastern Europe had been fundamentally and permanently altered. Communities that had existed for centuries were gone. Cities that had been 30 or 40% Jewish were now Judenrein, free of Jews, as Nazi terminology described it. The Yiddish language that had been spoken by millions across Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine was silenced, its speakers murdered, its literature and culture destroyed. The physical infrastructure of Jewish life, synagogues and schools and community centers and businesses, was demolished or appropriated for other uses. The few Jews who survived in hiding or through false identities on the Aryan side lived in constant terror of discovery, knowing that exposure meant immediate death. Some were hidden by righteous non-Jews who risked their own lives to protect Jewish neighbors or strangers, acts of extraordinary courage and compassion that provided moral light in overwhelming darkness. But others were betrayed by neighbors or strangers seeking reward money that Germans paid for information about hidden Jews. The Smalkownicy, Polish blackmailers who extorted money from Jews trying to pass as Aryan, operated extensively in Warsaw and other cities, creating a predatory economy that profited from desperation and fear. The children hidden in convents or with non-Jewish families faced psychological trauma that would mark them permanently. They were separated from parents and given new identities, told to forget their Jewish names and backgrounds, raised in Christian environments that felt foreign even when caregivers were kind. Some were too young to remember their original identities, growing up not knowing they were Jewish until after the war when relatives or Jewish organizations tried to reclaim them. The battles over these children after liberation would create new traumas, competing claims between surviving family members and the non-Jewish families who had raised them. The Soviet advance westward through 1944 brought liberation to some areas, but came too late for most ghetto populations. The Red Army found empty ghettos and mass graves, physical evidence of crimes that had been completed before they could be stopped. The soldiers who entered Majdanek in July 1944 found intact gas chambers and crematoria, the Germans having retreated too quickly to complete the demolition and concealment they had managed at other sites. The photographs and testimony from Majdanek provided early evidence of the industrial murder that would be more fully documented when Auschwitz was liberated in January 1945. The liquidation of the ghettos represented the completion of the first two phases of the final solution. Phase 1 had been concentration, gathering Jewish populations into ghettos where they could be controlled and monitored. Phase 2 had been exploitation, extracting labor and remaining wealth while populations were weakened through starvation and disease. Phase 3 was extermination, the systematic murder of entire communities in facilities designed specifically for that purpose. By the time the ghettos were liquidated, phases 1 and 2 were complete, and phase 3 was well advanced, the machinery of death operating at full capacity, processing victims with efficiency that would have been impossible without the preliminary work the ghettos had accomplished. The historical debate about whether ghettoization was always intended as a preliminary to extermination or whether extermination became policy only after ghettos were established continues among scholars. The evidence suggests that Nazi intentions evolved, that multiple approaches were considered simultaneously, that the final solution as implemented emerged from the intersection of ideological goals, logistical possibilities, and the radicalizing effects of the war itself. But regardless of when the decision for total extermination was made, the ghettos served that purpose perfectly, concentrating populations for easier deportation, weakening them so they couldn't resist effectively, and providing cover through the language of public health and economic management for policies whose actual purpose was murder. The liquidation left behind a landscape of absence, empty spaces where communities had been, silence where Yiddish voices had filled streets and marketplaces, ruins where synagogues had stood, gaps in the social and economic and cultural fabric of Eastern European cities that would never be filled. The destruction was not only of individuals, but of entire worlds, ways of life that had developed over centuries, traditions and knowledge and cultures that existed in people's minds and practices and were erased when those people were murdered. The ghettos were not only prisons where people suffered and died, but also the final chapters of a civilization that was being systematically destroyed, its traces removed from the earth as thoroughly as the people who had created and sustained it. Chapter 15. Memory and Legacy. January 27, 1945. Soviet troops entered Auschwitz and found approximately 7,000 prisoners, the ones too weak or sick to be evacuated when Germans fled days earlier. The soldiers also found evidence that would take years to fully catalog. Hundreds of thousands of shoes, piles of human hair, suitcases marked with names and addresses of people who had believed they were going to resettlement, crematorium facilities designed to process thousands of bodies daily, gas chambers whose purpose was unmistakable. But they found no ghettos because the ghettos were gone, liquidated months or years earlier, their populations murdered in the very facilities the Soviets were now discovering. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender, but liberation came too late for the millions who had lived and died behind ghetto walls. The survivors who emerged from camps and hiding places in forests discovered a world fundamentally altered, communities that had existed for centuries completely destroyed, families reduced to one or two individuals from groups that had numbered dozens, a civilization erased so thoroughly that reconstruction seemed impossible. The question facing survivors was not only how to rebuild lives, but how to ensure that what had been destroyed would be remembered, that the voices silenced would somehow still be heard. Among the first acts of survivors was the search for family members and the terrible process of learning who had lived and who had died. Organizations established survivor registries, lists posted in displaced persons camps, and published in newspapers, people desperately scanning names hoping to find relatives or friends. The Red Cross facilitated family reunification efforts, but the searches more often ended in confirmation of death than in joyful reunion. Entire families have been murdered. Of groups that numbered in the hundreds, single individuals survived. The statistical likelihood of finding living relatives was crushingly low, yet people searched because hope was all they had. The physical return of former homes was often devastating. Survivors who went back to Warsaw or Łódź or Vilna found their apartments occupied by strangers who had no intention of returning property. They found neighbors who had collaborated or who had simply stood by while Jews were murdered. They faced continuing anti-Semitism from people who resented survivors' return, who preferred that Jews remain absent or dead. Some survivors were killed in post-war pogroms, murdered by their former neighbors after surviving years in camps and ghettos. The message was clear. There was no home to return to, no community to rebuild in the places where destruction had been total. But there was evidence to recover and testimony to preserve. In September 1946, workers excavating in the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto discovered the first cache of the Oneg Shabbat archive, buried in milk cans and metal boxes, exactly where Emanuel Ringelblum and his collaborators had hidden them. The documents were damaged but legible, thousands of pages documenting ghetto life from inside the experience, preserved by people who knew they wouldn't survive but were determined that the truth would. A second cache was found in December 1950, and though a third was never recovered, the materials that survived provided invaluable testimony about daily life in the ghetto from those who lived it. Ringelblum himself did not survive to see his archive recovered. He had hidden with his family on the Aryan side after the ghetto's destruction, sheltered by a Polish friend. But the hiding place was discovered in March 1944, and Ringelblum, his wife, his 13-year-old son, and approximately 35 other Jews hidden in the same location were all executed by the Germans. He died knowing he had created the archive, but not knowing whether it would be found, whether the truth he had worked so desperately to preserve would reach the audiences he had hoped to educate. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, brought Nazi leaders to account for crimes that included the ghettoization and murder of European Jews. The evidence presented included German documents, photographs, and testimony from survivors who described what they had endured. The concept of crimes against humanity was developed partially in response to the Holocaust, recognizing that certain acts transcended normal legal categories, that the systematic attempt to destroy entire populations required new frameworks for justice and accountability. But the trials also revealed how difficult it would be to fully document and prosecute the crimes. Many perpetrators had died during the war or fled to countries that wouldn't extradite them. The evidence had often been destroyed by Germans attempting to conceal their crimes. Survivors' testimony was powerful, but couldn't possibly convey the full scope of suffering experienced by millions who had not survived to testify. The legal process, necessary and important as it was, could never adequately address the moral and human dimensions of what had occurred. The State of Israel was established in May 1948, providing a homeland for survivors who had nowhere else to go and creating a national framework for remembering the Holocaust. The law of return granted automatic citizenship to any Jew who immigrated to Israel, recognizing that the statelessness and lack of refuge during the Holocaust had contributed to the catastrophe. Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, was established in 1953 with the mission of documenting the Holocaust and honoring its victims and the righteous Gentiles who had risked their lives to save Jews. The survivors themselves became living testimony, though many initially struggled to speak about their experiences. The trauma was too fresh, the losses too devastating, the difficulty of conveying the reality to people who hadn't experienced it too overwhelming. Some survivors built new lives and tried to move forward without dwelling on the past. Others felt compelled to testify, to ensure that the world knew what had happened, that denial or minimization would be countered with direct testimony from those who had been there. The children who survived faced particular challenges in bearing witness. They had been so young during the Holocaust that their memories were fragmentary and confused, mixing real events with trauma-influenced recollections. Some had been hidden and given false identities, spending years not knowing they were Jewish, their original identities recovered only after liberation. These hidden children often struggled with questions of identity throughout their lives, feeling neither fully Jewish nor fully part of the Christian environments where they had been concealed. The psychological impact of ghetto experience on survivors was profound and lasting. What would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder was nearly universal among survivors, manifesting in nightmares and anxiety and hypervigilance and difficulty trusting. Survivor guilt was common, the painful question of why I survived when others died having no satisfactory answer. Depression and relationship difficulties affected many survivors, the trauma they had experienced creating barriers to normal emotional connection and functioning. Yet survivors also demonstrated extraordinary resilience. They rebuilt lives from nothing. They married and had children, creating new families to replace those that had been destroyed. They built businesses and careers. They contributed to their communities and to the wider world. The survival itself was an act of defiance, proof that the Nazi attempt at total destruction had failed, that Jewish life continued despite everything that had been done to prevent it. The debate about how to remember the Holocaust began almost immediately and continues to this day. Should the focus be on Jewish victimization or on Jewish resistance? Should the ghettos be remembered primarily as places of suffering or as sites where culture and humanity persisted against all odds? How could the particular character of Jewish suffering be acknowledged while also recognizing other victim groups, including Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and others whom the Nazis had targeted for destruction? The role of non-Jewish populations during the Holocaust also required confronting. The Germans had perpetrated the crimes, but they had often been assisted by local collaborators who helped identify Jews, guarded ghettos, participated in deportations, and sometimes murdered Jews independently of German orders. The question of collaboration versus resistance in occupied countries was painful and politically charged, involving national narratives and collective memory in ways that made honest reckoning difficult. The righteous Gentiles who had risked their lives to save Jews deserved recognition that was often slow in coming. People like Irina Sendler, who smuggled approximately 2,500 children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, operated in secrecy during the war and received little acknowledgement afterward until survivors began telling their stories. Jan Karski, a Polish resistance fighter who witnessed the Warsaw Ghetto and reported on it to Western governments, spent decades trying to convince the world to take seriously what he had seen, his testimony initially dismissed or minimized by those who found it too terrible to believe. The physical sites where ghettos had existed presented questions about memorialization. Should the ruins be preserved as evidence and memorial, or should cities be rebuilt without the constant reminder of tragedy? Warsaw rebuilt its old town from the ruins, reconstructing the historic architecture that had been destroyed. But the ghetto area was not restored to its pre-war configuration. New buildings rose on streets where hundreds of thousands had starved and suffered. Monuments were eventually erected, markers acknowledging what had happened. But the living presence of the ghetto was gone, replaced by modern construction that bore no physical relationship to the past. The few remaining ghetto buildings took on memorial significance. The apartment at Mila 18 in Warsaw, site of the ZOB headquarters bunker, where Mordecai and Neil Wicks died, became a pilgrimage site. The fragments of the ghetto wall that still stood were preserved as monuments. The cemeteries where hundreds of thousands were buried in mass graves became memorial sites where descendants could come to mourn ancestors whose individual graves would never be identified. The testimony of survivors became increasingly important as time passed, and the number of living witnesses declined. Organizations like the USC Shoah Foundation, established by Steven Spielberg, videotaped testimony from thousands of survivors, preserving their voices and stories before they were lost to time. The testimony varied widely in content and emphasis, each survivor emphasizing different aspects of their experience. But collectively, they provided a mosaic of memory that documented the Holocaust from countless individual perspectives. The second and third generations, children and grandchildren of survivors, carried their own burdens related to the Holocaust. They grew up with parents who had been traumatized, living in households where the past was either obsessively present or deliberately suppressed, both extremes creating difficulties. They inherited survivor guilt without having survived anything themselves. They felt pressure to justify the sacrifices their parents' generation had made, to live lives worthy of the memories of those who had been murdered. The transmission of trauma across generations became a subject of psychological and sociological study. Educational efforts to teach about the Holocaust faced the challenge of conveying reality that seemed beyond normal human experience. How do you explain to students who have never known hunger what it means to starve for years? How do you make comprehensible the industrial murder of millions? The risk was either making it seem too ordinary, just another historical atrocity among many, or making it seem so extraordinary that it became incomprehensible, reduced to statistics and abstract horror that failed to register emotionally. The most effective educational approaches combined historical documentation with personal testimony, pairing the statistical reality of millions murdered with individual stories that made the humanity visible. In Frank's diary, though it described hiding rather than ghetto experience, became one of the most widely read Holocaust testimonies because it gave faces and personality to the victims, made the tragedy comprehensible through one girl's voice and experience. Similarly, testimony from ghetto survivors like Marek Edelman and Simha Rodham provided first-hand accounts that educated generations born decades after the events. The phrase "never again" became a rallying cry, expressing the determination that such atrocities would never be permitted to occur again. But the reality was more complex than the slogan suggested. Genocides occurred in Cambodia and Rwanda and Bosnia and Darfur, demonstrating that the lessons of the Holocaust had not prevented other mass atrocities. The question became not whether never again was achievable, but what specific steps could be taken to reduce the likelihood of future genocides. What early warning signs could be identified? What international mechanisms could intervene before situations escalated to mass murder? The legacy of the ghettos, specifically within Holocaust memory, is sometimes overshadowed by the death camps that came after and often determined their fate. Auschwitz and Treblinka became symbols of the Holocaust in ways that the Warsaw Ghetto or Łódź Ghetto perhaps did not for general audiences. But for those who study the Holocaust carefully, the ghettos represent essential chapters in the story, the places where Nazi intentions became clear through implementation, where Jewish responses range from resistance to collaboration to desperate survival, where the daily reality of persecution was lived for years before the final phase of immediate murder began. The voices from the ghettos, preserved in archives and testimony and literature, continue speaking decades after their deaths. They tell us about human resilience and human cruelty, about the persistence of culture under impossible circumstances, about the choices people face when all options are terrible. They remind us that the millions who died were individuals with names and families and dreams, not just statistics. They challenge us to remember accurately and completely, to honor both suffering and resistance, to learn lessons that might prevent future atrocities, even as we acknowledge how difficult those lessons are to apply. The memory of the ghettos is carried forward by survivors who are now in their 80s and 90s, their number declining each year as biology takes what the Nazis couldn't. When a last survivor dies, the nature of Holocaust memory will change, shifting from living testimony to historical documentation, from first-hand accounts to second- and third-generation transmission. The responsibility for maintaining accurate memory and preventing distortion or denial will fall entirely to those who never experienced the events directly, making the documentation and education all the more critical. But the voices will not be silenced as long as the testimony is preserved and taught, as long as the archives are maintained and studied, as long as new generations commit to remembering what their ancestors experienced. The children who smuggled food through the walls, the teachers who ran secret schools, the fighters who chose to resist, the archivists who buried the truth, the ordinary people who survived impossible circumstances, all of them continue speaking through the records they left behind. Their voices call across decades, demanding that we remember, that we understand, that we ensure such horrors never happen again, that we recognize the warning signs when ordinary people are demonized and isolated and marked for destruction. The ghetto walls are gone, demolished by Germans, or time, or post-war reconstruction. But the voices from behind those walls echo still, reminding us of what happened when hatred became policy, when evil was industrialized, when humanity failed its most basic test, and millions paid with their lives.